Across the frozen expanse of the Arctic, countless ships and daring explorers have vanished, leaving behind only whispers, skeletal remains, and shattered records. Entire crews froze, starved, or disappeared without a trace, swallowed by a landscape as beautiful as it is deadly. From icebound vessels to misled balloonists, each story is a puzzle of ambition, misfortune, and the relentless power of nature. Journey through these chilling accounts and witness the reality of human courage tested against an environment that tolerates no mistake. Every frozen ridge, drifting iceberg, and vanished ship tells a tale that refuses to be forgotten, daring you to uncover the mysteries hidden beneath layers of ice and silence. Some answers were recorded, others remain elusive, and all invite you to confront the Arctic's most haunting enigmas. The Franklin Expedition, 1845. In the summer of 1845, 2 British ships slipped quietly out of the River Thames, bound for the Arctic. They were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, vessels that had already proved themselves in harsh polar waters and were now reinforced with iron plating, steam engines, and thousands of provisions packed neatly into cans. The mission was ambitious: to find and finally chart the last untraversed section of the Northwest Passage, a sea route that promised to connect Europe with Asia through the ice-clogged channels of the Canadian Arctic. At the head stood Sir John Franklin, a seasoned officer of the Royal Navy, admired by some for his determination and doubted by others for his age and health. Alongside him were 128 officers and men, each stepping aboard with the knowledge that they were entering the most dangerous waters on Earth. The ships were well equipped for survival, at least on paper. They carried more than 3 years' worth of food, preserved in tins by the relatively new method of canning, which was thought to be a safeguard against starvation. Coal bunkers were filled to feed their auxiliary engines, while libraries, musical instruments, and even fine silver tableware were loaded to maintain morale and discipline during the long polar nights. It seemed at the outset that Franklin's crew had every advantage over the wilderness that had swallowed so many expeditions before them. Yet what lay ahead was an icebound labyrinth that did not bend to human planning or imperial confidence. After leaving Britain, the expedition was last seen by whalers in Baffin Bay in late July 1845. From there, the ships pressed into Lancaster Sound, the broad gateway into the Arctic archipelago. Then the record falls silent. No further sightings were reported, no messages were dispatched back to Britain, and no ship returned. The Arctic had closed its grip, and the 2 proud vessels vanished into silence. The Admiralty expected a long absence, but as the years stretched on without word, anxiety spread across the nation. By 1848, Franklin's absence had become one of the greatest maritime mysteries of the century, and search parties were dispatched to comb the ice for any sign of the missing men. The first real clues emerged in 1850 when searchers stumbled upon bleak camps on Beechy Island. There, in the frozen ground, they found 3 graves marked with simple headboards. The names were John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell, all young men who had died during the first winter of the expedition in 1846. Their graves suggested that Franklin's ships had survived at least 1 season in the Arctic, but the sight of 3 freshly dug resting places, preserved in permafrost on a desolate shore, carried a haunting weight. What had claimed them so early in the voyage, when food stores were still full and the ships were still intact? The bodies, exhumed more than a century later, revealed chilling details. They were remarkably preserved by the cold, their faces still recognizable, and their tissues laced with unusually high levels of lead. This discovery hinted at poisoned food supplies or contaminated water systems, but the exact cause remains debated. In the years that followed, more fragments emerged from the ice. Inuit hunters shared accounts of pale men dragging sledges across the tundra, starving and desperate. They told stories of abandoned ships caught fast in ice, and of sailors who dropped one by one along the shores of King William Island. These testimonies, passed orally through generations, painted a grim picture that the official records could never fully capture. The details varied, but the theme was always the same. The proud expedition had collapsed into hunger, exposure, and death far from home. Yet the exact sequence of events and the decisions made by Franklin and his officers remained hidden beneath snow and time. The most startling piece of evidence surfaced in 1859 when searchers led by Francis Leopold McClintock discovered a small tin cylinder wedged into a cairn of stones on King William Island. Inside was a message written in two parts. The first section, dated May 1847, reported that the ships were secure in the ice and all was well, but the second, scrawled in the margins nearly a year later, told a darker story. By April 1848, Franklin himself was dead, the ships were abandoned, and 105 survivors were preparing to march south toward the Back River. The brief note, stark and unfinished, was the only official record of the expedition ever recovered. What followed after they left the ships was left entirely to speculation and scattered testimony. Decades later, skeletal remains were found along the route the men would have taken, scattered as if men had collapsed in ones and twos along the way. Some bones bore marks that suggested desperate measures had been taken to survive. While investigators debated whether these cuts were evidence of cannibalism, Inuit witnesses had already long spoken of men boiling boots for food and of cooking flesh when no other choice remained. To many Victorians back in Britain, these tales were unthinkable, clashing with their image of naval discipline and honour. But to others, the bones themselves whispered a truth that could not be ignored. The fate of the ships themselves remained one of the greatest lingering mysteries. For more than 150 years, no one knew where the Erebus and Terror had gone down. Search after search combed the waters around King William Island with little success. It was only in 2014 that the wreck of HMS Erebus was finally discovered in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, sitting eerily upright in the shallow water, its hull remarkably well preserved by the cold. 2 years later, HMS Terror was located in Terror Bay, also astonishingly intact, with its windows still in place and its equipment undisturbed. The discovery of the ships brought answers to some questions, but also deepened the enigma. Why had one ship been sailed far south of the last known position, and who had guided it there after the crew was supposed to have abandoned it? Archaeologists who have since explored the wrecks have found dishes still stacked neatly, bottles resting in cabinets, and even shoes lying where sailors must have left them. The ships appear less like wrecks than like ghostly time capsules, frozen in the very moment they were deserted. Yet neither wreck has yielded the personal journals, detailed logs, or maps that might finally explain what happened during those missing years. The Arctic, it seems, has guarded its secrets tightly, keeping the final thoughts of Franklin's men beyond reach. Even today, the Franklin expedition continues to unsettle anyone who looks too closely. It is a story not only of imperial ambition, but also of human fragility in the face of merciless ice. Each discovery raises questions as quickly as it provides answers. Why did so many men succumb so quickly, when provisions should have lasted for years? Why did the survivors attempt such a hopeless trek across barren tundra, rather than waiting in place for rescue? And what became of their final journals and personal accounts, which could have illuminated their ordeal? The silence of those missing pages is as haunting as the wrecks themselves. The Arctic wastes hold many tragedies, but few cast such a long shadow as Franklin's vanished fleet, and beneath the ice the silence still hides what really happened to them. The Jens Munch Expedition, 1619. On the windswept coast of Denmark, in the bustling port of Copenhagen, Jens Munch prepared for a journey that promised both glory and peril. Unlike the polished naval officers who often commanded royal fleets, Munch was a man shaped by hardship, having grown up in poverty before clawing his way into prominence through skill at sea. When King Christian IV appointed him to lead an expedition in search of the Northwest Passage, the promise of discovery outweighed the dangers that lurked in the icy unknown. From the very beginning, Munch's mission was steeped in ambition. His two ships, the Enheuningen and the smaller Lamprinnen, were stocked with provisions and a crew of over 60 men, their spirits high as they sailed toward the edge of the map. The king's vision was clear: to find a sea route that would link Europe to Asia and bring wealth to Denmark. Yet beneath the optimism ran a current of foreboding, for the Arctic had already swallowed men who believed they could outlast its grip. What lay ahead tested not just the ships but every soul aboard. Crossing the North Atlantic, the men endured storms that battered the decks and threatened to splinter the masts. Sailors clung to ropes as waves surged over the hull, soaking them with icy spray that turned skin raw and stiff. Still, Munch pressed on, his resolve as unyielding as the keel beneath his feet. To him, every hardship was simply another step closer to the elusive passage that had lured explorers for generations. As the weeks passed, the landscape itself began to shift into something alien. Greenland loomed to the west, its towering cliffs wrapped in snow and silence. Beyond lay Hudson Bay, an immense inland sea stretching farther than the eye could grasp. For the crew, the bay's open waters seemed a promise of success. They believed they had found the threshold of the passage at last, unaware that its frozen arms would soon close around them with merciless strength. What Monk could not have foreseen was how quickly hope would sour into hardship. The very bay that seemed a gateway to Asia became their prison, sealing them in as the ice thickened and the winds cut deeper with each passing night. The dream of discovery gave way to a grim daily struggle for survival, where even the smallest tasks, like lighting a fire or carrying water, became monumental battles against the cold. The men anchored near the mouth of what would later be known as the Churchill River. Summer was fading and the days shortened with alarming speed. Though Monk urged them to prepare for winter, the task was overwhelming. They built makeshift shelters, fortified the ships, and rationed their supplies, but the Arctic night advanced too quickly. By the time the first deep snows came, the expedition was already at the mercy of a land that knew nothing of pity. The silence of the Arctic winter was more suffocating than the storms of the Atlantic. Snow muffled every sound, leaving only the creak of ice pressing against the hull and the rasp of men's laboured breaths. In such stillness, time itself seemed to slow, trapping the crew in a season that felt endless. For those still able to move, the darkness blurred the boundary between night and day, unravelling the rhythm of life they had once known. Disease struck quietly at first, creeping into the camp with a cough, a fever, and swollen limbs. Scurvy, the sailors' old enemy, spread among the men, draining their strength until they could no longer work the sails or haul provisions. Hunger followed, gnawing at their bellies as the salted meat and ship's biscuit dwindled. In the frozen wilderness, even hunting became futile, for the caribou had vanished and the fish beneath the ice lay beyond their reach. By the heart of winter, despair had become as tangible as the frost. Records from Monk's journal paint a grim picture, men dying in their hammocks, others raving with fever, their cries echoing against the hull. The once proud expedition dwindled into a collection of gaunt faces, haunted by the smell of death that lingered over the camp. Burial was often impossible, for the ground was too frozen to dig, and the corpses were left on the ice, silent reminders of their fate. Centuries later, archaeologists who traced Monk's route near Churchill uncovered remnants that confirmed the ordeal. Nails, pottery shards, and fragments of tools hinted at the desperate attempts to endure the unendurable. These findings, though scattered, aligned with the accounts preserved in Monk's journal, bridging the written record with the physical evidence of collapse. Every object carried the weight of the final days, frozen in time beneath layers of soil and ice. Through it all, Monk refused to surrender. He kept writing, his journal filled with the same determination that had carried him from poverty to command. Each entry reveals a man who clung to duty, even as death hollowed the ranks around him. When spring finally thawed the ice, only Monk and 2 others had survived from more than 60 who had set out with hope. Weak and barely able to walk, they managed to bring the Lamprinen back across the Atlantic, a voyage that itself seemed impossible given their condition. Back in Denmark, the reception was not what one might expect for a man who had returned from the edge of death. While Monk was praised for his perseverance, many at court could not overlook the scale of the disaster. Instead of securing glory for Denmark, the expedition had drained resources and returned only with tales of misery. This uneasy legacy followed Monk until his death, marking him as both a survivor and a symbol of ambitions crushed by the Arctic's unyielding will. The survival of Jens Monk was as remarkable as the tragedy itself. Returning to Denmark, he was hailed for his endurance, yet the shadows of his failed expedition never fully lifted. The dream of the Northwest Passage had once again claimed lives while withholding its secret. Monk's ships and the bones of his men remained in the Canadian wilderness, silent witnesses to the cost of chasing what lay beyond reach. Weathered journal pages and scattered artifacts tell the lingering story of Jens Monk centuries later, an expedition meant to open new worlds, but leaving far more questions than answers. Why did only a handful live when so many others perished within reach of open waters? What unseen forces of isolation, disease, and despair conspired to break them when survival seemed within grasp? And as the icy winds still sweep over the mouth of the Churchill River, one cannot help but wonder what secrets remain buried in that frozen ground, waiting for the silence to finally give them voice. The Barents Expedition, 1596. The late 16th century was a time of unrelenting ambition, when the Dutch Republic dreamed of opening a northern gateway to China and wresting control of trade from Iberian powers. At the centre of this vision was Willem Barents, a navigator from Terschelling whose skill had already brought him deep into uncharted seas. His third voyage, launched in 1596, was more than a mission of discovery. It carried the weight of national pride and the lure of riches hidden behind the frozen horizon. Off the coast of Novaya Zemlya, where the Barents Sea brushes against the Arctic Circle, the voyage turned from promise to peril. The ships found themselves hemmed in by drifting floes, unable to break free as ice closed around them like jaws. The short northern summer gave way too quickly, and what should have been open water hardened into a prison. Barents and his crew had no choice but to prepare for a winter unlike any they had known before. Timbers groaned and tools clanged as the men began building what would become their fortress against the cold. Het Behouden Huis, the safe house. Using driftwood and scavenged planks from their immobilized ships, they constructed walls and a roof that offered only the barest shield against the elements. Smoke from their fires struggled to escape through chimneys of packed snow, filling the air inside with a heavy haze. Yet this house of wood and ice was their only hope of surviving the endless Arctic night. The details of their confinement survive because Gerrit de Veer, one of the sailors, kept a journal that chronicled the ordeal. His words describe not only the bleak surroundings, but also the strained attempts at keeping life bearable. He recorded the endless repairs to the house, the rationing of food, and the rare moments of grim humour when the men tried to mask their despair. Without his testimony, much of what happened inside Het Behouden Huis would have remained hidden beneath the snow. Time itself became their enemy, stretching into a darkness that seemed without end. For months the sun never rose above the horizon, leaving the men in a twilight world where every day bled into the next. The air inside the hut grew damp, the walls rhymed with frost, and their minds began to falter under the oppressive weight of monotony. Outside, the howling wind and cracking ice reminded them that their shelter was nothing more than a fragile barrier against an unforgiving wilderness. To fight the cold, the men devised makeshift tools and even attempted to distill brandy from wine by freezing out the water content, seeking warmth in any form they could imagine. They lined their clothes with fox and bearskins, patched together with sinew and rough stitching. These efforts brought fleeting relief, but the deeper winter pressed in, and every spark of ingenuity seemed to collapse under the sheer weight of the Arctic night. Sudden terror came in the form of white shadows that prowled just beyond the firelight. Polar bears, drawn by the scent of food and the heat of human presence, circled the hut and attacked with terrifying ferocity. Several times the crew fought them off with pikes and muskets, their hearts pounding as massive bodies crashed against their defences. Each encounter was a reminder that they were not only prisoners of the ice, but also intruders in a land that had its own ruthless guardians. One of the most chilling encounters came when a massive bear burst directly through the thin walls of the hut. Chaos erupted as men scrambled for weapons, smoke from the fire filling the room while claws tore at the timber. When the beast finally fell, it left the crew shaken and blooded, their sanctuary no longer feeling secure. The carcass provided meat, but the victory was hollow, for it underscored how fragile their defences truly were. Bodies soon betrayed their owners as scurvy tightened its grip. Teeth loosened, gums bled, and limbs swelled with unbearable pain. The men grew gaunt and weary, and every meal of salted meat and scant preserved food brought less strength than the one before. Hunger hollowed them, and thirst gnawed at their resolve when fresh water could not be easily carved from the ice. Even as they clung to routine, the boundaries of endurance thinned until every day felt like a negotiation with death. All eyes turned to Willem Barents as his condition worsened. Once the unshakable figure at the helm, he grew frail and exhausted, unable to rise from his bunk as sickness consumed him. His presence had been a steadying force, the thread that held them together in the dark, but as he weakened, so too did their sense of direction. The men began to speak in hushed tones, their confidence crumbling as the leader they trusted faded before their eyes. When the ice finally loosened its grip in June of 1597, the survivors gathered what strength remained to launch 2 open boats into the frigid water. They rowed southward with trembling arms, every pull of the oars a desperate act of defiance against despair. Many perished along the way, but some reached safety and brought news of the voyage that had gone so terribly wrong. Barren himself did not live to see freedom. He died during the retreat, leaving behind a silence heavier than any storm. For the Dutch, Barren's death was not simply another maritime loss. His voyages became emblematic of both the daring and the danger of Arctic exploration. Maps and books carried his name, and generations of sailors learned his routes even as they feared repeating his fate. In Amsterdam, his memory lingered as a testament to ambition pushed too far, where glory turned to ruin on the edges of ice. Amid the frozen expanses of Novaya Zemlya, explorers centuries later stumbled upon the remains of Het Behouden Huis. Inside the collapsed structure, relics lay preserved. Cooking pots, tools, clothing stiff with age, and even the bones of those who never escaped. Each artifact spoke of the desperate ingenuity and final struggles of men stranded at the edge of the world. In those frozen fragments of wood and iron, the story of Barren's last voyage seemed to whisper across time, as though the house itself remembered. When later expeditions examined the site in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found the hut astonishingly well preserved, as if time itself had stalled on that frozen shore. The bones of animals they had hunted, scraps of leather shoes and rusted firearms all lay in eerie silence, each piece a frozen echo of lives that had fought and failed to outlast the Arctic. Standing among those remains, explorers described an overwhelming sense of presence, as if the men of 1596 had only just stepped outside into the snow. And yet the wind that still sweeps over the ruins seems to carry questions that no discovery has ever answered, as if the land itself refuses to reveal the full truth of what happened in that house of ice and shadows. The Karluk disaster, 1913. Few Arctic stories begin with such promise and collapse so quickly as the voyage of the Karluk. In the summer of 1913, this sturdy vessel, a former whaler converted for polar exploration, carried the hopes of the Canadian Arctic expedition. Under the leadership of Vilhjalmur Stephensen, the mission set sail to chart unknown stretches of the Arctic and collect scientific data that might reshape what was known about the far north. The ship's decks bristled with equipment and anticipation, yet hidden beneath the optimism was a flaw that would soon prove fatal. The ship had not been built for the relentless pressure of pack ice. Early signs of danger emerged when the Karluk pushed westward from Alaska into the Beaufort Sea. The expedition had scarcely begun when the ship found itself locked fast by thickening ice, unable to move despite the crew's frantic efforts. The ocean around them hardened into an unyielding prison, and within weeks the vessel had ceased to be a ship at sea, becoming instead an unwilling fortress drifting wherever the ice chose to carry it. Supplies remained abundant at first, but the men soon understood that freedom might never come without intervention from outside forces they could not control. The strangest element of this crisis was not the imprisonment of the ship, but the actions of its leader. Stephensen, convinced he could hunt caribou inland, departed the Karluk with a small party in September 1913, promising to return in a few days. He never came back. Instead, he continued overland, eventually reaching safety, leaving Captain Robert Bartlett in sole command of the ship and its crew. The sudden absence of Stephensen left many men with unanswered questions about whether their leader had abandoned them or if circumstances had simply dictated an irreversible split. Not all of the men accepted Stephenson's disappearance in the same way. Some believed he had acted with cold calculation, distancing himself from a ship he already knew was doomed, while others clung to the possibility that he might somehow return with help. This division left the crew unsettled, their loyalty fractured between the man who had abandoned them and the captain, now forced to shoulder responsibility. The uncertainty of leadership added a psychological weight that grew heavier with every passing day on the ice. As winter tightened its grip, the trapped Karluk drifted further into the Arctic Ocean, its position uncertain, its crew growing anxious. The men's daily routines became rituals of survival, yet beneath the surface lay an increasing sense of dread. Each creak of the ice against the hull echoed like a warning, and by January 1914 the ship's fate was sealed. Under immense pressure, the Karluk's timbers splintered, her hull collapsing with a sound that witnesses described as both terrifying and final. The ship that had promised glory disappeared beneath the ice, leaving her men stranded on drifting floes without the means to navigate their way home. What followed was not a single ordeal, but a series of them. Captain Bartlett, though a strict disciplinarian, quickly assumed the mantle of survival leader. He established makeshift camps on the ice, organising supplies and maintaining morale where he could. Yet the polar night, with its crushing darkness and bitter winds, brought challenges no plan could fully overcome. Frostbite, starvation, and despair became constant companions, and disagreements among the men often flared into bitter disputes. The ice beneath them was alive, shifting unpredictably, threatening to shatter at any moment and carry tents, supplies, and men into the black water below. Nature itself seemed to conspire against them in ways both subtle and brutal. Polar bears prowled the edges of camp, drawn by the scent of food and waste, forcing men to keep constant watch with rifles in hand. The ice groaned and shifted at night, producing noises so eerie that some swore they resembled voices in the darkness. Even when conditions were briefly calm, there was no true safety, only the illusion of it, soon shattered by the next crack, storm, or sudden attack from the wilderness. The human cost grew more haunting with each passing week. Some men succumbed to scurvy, their bodies wasting despite every effort to provide nutrition from limited stores. Others grew disoriented, weakened not only by hunger but by the psychological strain of endless white horizons and the knowledge that help might never come. There were reports of men disappearing suddenly into the cracks that tore across the ice fields, swallowed without a trace, their fates as mysterious as the silence that followed their loss. Nature itself seemed to conspire against them in ways both subtle and brutal. Polar bears prowled the edges of camp, drawn by the scent of food and waste, forcing men to keep constant watch with rifles in hand. The ice groaned and shifted at night, producing noises so eerie that some swore they resembled voices in the darkness. Even when conditions were briefly calm, there was no true safety, only the illusion of it, soon shattered by the next crack, storm, or sudden attack from the wilderness. Through it all, Bartlett became a figure both feared and respected. Recognizing that salvation would not come to them, he resolved to leave the drifting camp and seek help. Together with an Inuit hunter named Kataktovik, Bartlett embarked on a grueling trek across frozen seas and desolate land toward Siberia. Their journey was an epic in itself, marked by storms, near starvation, and unrelenting cold. Against staggering odds, Bartlett reached civilization and alerted authorities, setting in motion a rescue effort. Yet even as relief parties prepared, the survivors left behind continued to dwindle, their situation worsening by the day. When rescuers finally arrived months later, they discovered only a fraction of the original crew alive. Out of the 25 who had once been aboard the Karluk, less than half survived the ordeal. The stories carried back by those who endured painted a picture of courage, suffering, and inexplicable fortune. Some had perished mere days before rescue, their strength finally gone. Others clung to life in ways they could barely explain, surviving injuries, hunger, and the crushing solitude of the Arctic night. Even the aftermath of the disaster was clouded by suspicion and conflicting memories. Survivors accused one another of hoarding supplies or failing in their duties, while Stefansson's reputation became a matter of fierce debate in both scientific and public circles. Some hailed Bartlett as the true hero, the man who endured unbearable hardship to save what lives he could, while others questioned whether his stern methods had driven certain men to despair. The lack of a single agreed narrative ensures that the Karluk remains as much a riddle of human choices as a tale of ice and survival. More than a century later, the disaster still leaves unanswered questions. Did Stefansson deliberately abandon the Karluk, prioritizing his own survival and reputation over the lives of his men? Or was his departure an ill-fated attempt at securing resources that simply spiraled out of control? The documents left behind, along with survivors' conflicting accounts, never provide a single clear answer. What is certain is that the Karluk's fate illustrates both the extremes of human endurance and the inscrutable dangers of the Arctic, where leadership, chance, and ice intertwine to shape outcomes that still defy simple explanation. The shadow of the Karluk disaster remains not just in the history of polar exploration, but in the silence of the Arctic itself, where the ice holds secrets it has never released. The Polaris Expedition, 1871. What drives men to risk everything for a line on a map no one had yet touched? For Charles Francis Hall, the American explorer who had already chased Arctic secrets for years, the North Pole was more than a destination. It was a prize that could prove American strength in an age when other nations had dominated polar ventures. When the ship Polaris sailed in 1871, carrying a crew of nearly 30 men and women, it carried not only ambition but also the fragile hopes of a leader, with little formal training yet boundless determination. Hall had earned his reputation not through academy halls or naval service, but by living for years among the Inuit, learning survival where no textbooks could teach it. That raw knowledge gave him confidence, but it also set him apart from the polished officers around him, who judged his methods as crude and his leadership as suspect. Even before the ship vanished into the Arctic dark, the seeds of discord had been sown. Leadership was never secure aboard Polaris. Hall was the commander in name, but his authority was fragile from the start. He was a man without naval rank or years of seamanship, relying instead on his reputation from earlier Arctic expeditions. The ship's officers, many of them European-born and trained, questioned his decisions in private and sometimes openly. Friction simmered below the surface, the kind of quiet unrest that could remain hidden for weeks until crisis brought it boiling into view. Tension was heightened by cultural divides. German officers, American crewmen, and Inuit families each looked at the expedition with different expectations. A single chain of command was essential in a place where one mistake could mean death. Yet aboard Polaris, mistrust spread like cracks in the ice around them, growing wider with every passing day. Some swore Hall drank poisoned coffee, while others insisted he simply collapsed from exhaustion. In October of 1871, not long after the expedition reached the harsh coasts of northern Greenland, Hall suddenly fell violently ill. He accused members of his own crew of attempting to murder him. His words, reported by those at his bedside, painted a scene of paranoia, but what makes the story enduring is that traces of arsenic were later found in his remains. Whether his suspicions were justified or the delirium of sickness, his final days remain a chilling riddle. Witnesses later recalled that he tried to rise from his bed, gasping accusations, before sinking back, unable to continue. Dr. Emil Bessels, the ship's physician, remained close during Hall's decline, administering treatments that some later judged suspiciously ineffective. To this day, the scene aboard Polaris in those final hours is remembered less as the death of a leader and more as the opening act of a mystery. No one could agree who was in charge once Hall was gone. He died on November 8th, leaving behind a ship far from home and a crew now split between loyalties. The sailing master, Sidney Buddington, claimed command, yet he lacked Hall's singular drive to press forward. The physician, Dr. Emil Bessels, had influence but little trust from others. Rumours of poisoning did not vanish with Hall's death. Instead, they shadowed Bessels and deepened the crew's mistrust. The expedition's unity fractured at its core, and decisions that followed reflected hesitation, fear, and conflicting visions of survival. Though Hall's ambition was to reach the pole, Buddington's uncertain leadership left the ship wandering rather than advancing. Logbooks showed strange choices, long delays, questionable retreats, and an apparent lack of urgency even as conditions worsened. Every order was second-guessed, every choice measured against what might have been if Hall had lived. Far from home, the ship itself became a silent witness to the unravelling of the expedition. Polaris, once hailed as America's great hope for Arctic dominance, was reduced to a drifting ice-locked hulk. Sailors recorded in their journals that discipline eroded quickly after Hall's death, with officers bickering and orders ignored. Provisions were squandered, and equipment was abandoned in ways that baffled later investigators. What had begun as a national mission of prestige seemed to collapse into chaos, with the Arctic swallowing not just their goal but the very spirit of the enterprise. Ice stretched endlessly as 20 men clung to a floe, their future as fragile as the surface beneath them. In the months after Hall's death, storms and shifting ice trapped Polaris, and eventually part of the crew became separated, adrift on a sheet of frozen sea. Among them were men, women and children, including Inuit guides and families who had joined the voyage. For 6 long months they drifted, battered by wind and hunger, carrying only what supplies they had salvaged, in haste. When rescue finally came in the spring of 1873, their survival seemed nothing short of miraculous. but the ordeal left questions about why they had been stranded in the first place. Some records suggested that Buddington had allowed the ship to run aground and break apart, abandoning discipline at a moment when unity was most needed. Survivors spoke later of bitter arguments, careless navigation, and an eerie silence from those who had once sworn loyalty to Hall. Their safe return was celebrated, yet beneath the applause lingered an unspoken unease about how they had been left to drift so long on the mercy of the ice. What made their survival even more haunting was the testimony of the Inuit families who endured the drift alongside the crew. They spoke of rationing scraps, melting ice for water, and watching the horizon each day for ships that never appeared. Children grew thin and silent, their voices carried away by the winds that roared across the frozen sea. To the Inuit, survival was a testament to resilience and knowledge of the land, but to the Americans, it underscored a deeper humiliation. Their great polar expedition had survived not through planning or discipline, but through the endurance of those they had often treated as outsiders. Years later, the investigation into Hall's death revealed more questions than answers. An official inquiry examined testimony from surviving officers and men, but the accounts contradicted one another at nearly every turn. Some described Hall's suspicions as delusions, others spoke of bitter conflicts between him and Bessels, and still others described unexplained decisions by Buddington that seemed careless or reckless. The record of the expedition became a patchwork of voices, none aligning cleanly and none silencing the persistent rumour of murder. In the 1960s, when Hall's remains were exhumed in Greenland, modern testing confirmed the presence of arsenic, reopening debates that had seemed settled for nearly a century. Was the physician who treated him the killer? Was Hall targeted for his authority, his nationality, or his relentless ambition? The answers remain buried beneath layers of testimony, denial, and silence, leaving the story of Polaris unresolved in a way that chills even now. What survives from the Polaris expedition is not triumph or tragedy alone, but the lingering presence of a death that no investigation has ever fully explained. The Grinnell search parties, 1850s. Henry Grinnell was not a sailor, but his fortune became a lifeline for Arctic exploration. A wealthy New York merchant, he had followed the news of Sir John Franklin's disappearance with fascination, and as the years dragged on without answers, his interest grew into obsession. Grinnell never set foot in the Arctic himself, yet his patronage funded ships, supplied crews, and kept alive America's role in the search. To him, this was more than an act of philanthropy. It was a mission to restore hope and uncover the fate of men swallowed by the ice. On the barren shores of Beechy Island, searchers uncovered the first undeniable trace of Franklin's men. It was the summer of 1850, and under the direction of Lieutenant Edwin de Haven, two ships, the Advance and the Rescue, entered the Arctic waters funded by Grinnell. Their crews stumbled upon graves marked with simple headstones, belonging to 3 Franklin sailors who had perished early in the expedition. These silent markers, standing stark against the frozen ground, were the first real evidence of Franklin's path and the first confirmation that tragedy had struck. Yet the graves revealed only loss, not explanation, leaving the great mystery unsolved. Illness swept through de Haven's men long before they found answers, their strength fading in the endless dark of winter. During that first Grinnell voyage, scurvy crept into the crew, and the ice held the ships fast until the crushing pressure threatened to splinter their hulls. The search itself became a mirror of what had befallen Franklin's men: sickness, starvation, and the brutal trial of survival far from help. By the time the Advance and the Rescue returned, battered but intact, the men carried with them not only fragments of Franklin's trail, but also a glimpse of the same despair that must have stalked his doomed expedition. Those first hard lessons did not erase the determination of the searchers. In Washington and New York, public fascination with Franklin's fate only grew as news of the graves spread, and with it came pressure to launch yet another attempt. Newspapers praised the courage of the returning crews, even as they highlighted the unanswered questions that haunted every account. For Grinnell, the failures of one voyage became the justification for another, each setback deepening his resolve that the truth was waiting just beyond the next horizon of ice. Elisha Kent Kane stepped into command with determination, yet his authority was tested by hunger and doubt. The second Grinnell expedition, launched in 1853, carried Kane north into Smith Sound, where his ship was soon locked fast in ice. His men endured 2 long winters of privation, with frostbite eating into their hands and feet, and morale breaking under the weight of confinement. Mutiny simmered as supplies dwindled and leadership faltered. Kane kept discipline only through constant vigilance, and when the men at last abandoned the ship in 1855, they staggered across hundreds of miles of ice and water to reach safety. That they survived at all was a testament to their endurance, but the cost was heavy, and the questions of Franklin's fate remained largely unanswered. The role of Inuit knowledge became increasingly critical, though not always heeded. Kane and his men often relied on Inuit hunters for food and guidance, yet many of their reports about Franklin's lost crews were dismissed or mistrusted by European and American officers. Later accounts suggested that Inuit witnesses had described starving men dragging boats across the ice, but Kane's expedition never confirmed these sightings. The unwillingness to fully trust local testimony left a shadow over the search, suggesting that valuable clues may have slipped through their grasp. A spoon engraved with initials, a torn page from a Bible, a human bone weathered by cold, these became the voices of the missing. Relics uncovered by the Grinnell parties and other searchers gave tantalizing glimpses into Franklin's disaster. Each item confirmed that the lost expedition had pressed deeper into the Arctic than first believed, and each scrap hinted at suffering beyond measure. But none of these objects explained why Franklin's men abandoned their ships or why they perished in such numbers. Instead, the artifacts stood as eerie testaments, fragments of a greater story locked away by ice and silence. When rescue ships finally brought Kane and his surviving men back to America, they were celebrated as heroes, though their mission had failed to find Franklin. Kane himself, weakened by the ordeal, did not live many years after his return. His writings, however, painted vivid pictures of the Arctic wilderness, descriptions that stirred both admiration and unease. In those pages, readers glimpsed not only the endurance of his crew but also the strange allure of the ice, a place that seemed to take as much as it revealed. The Grinnell expeditions did not solve the Franklin puzzle, but they expanded the world's image of the Arctic as both majestic and merciless. In the decades that followed, fragments discovered by Grinnell's expeditions were revisited by later explorers, their significance re-evaluated in light of new testimony. What once seemed like isolated traces, a button, a piece of cloth, a tool left in the snow, began to form a mosaic that suggested a trail of suffering stretching across the Arctic. Yet, even with these patterns emerging, doubt remained, for the line between discovery and interpretation blurred easily in such a hostile land. Each object could be read in more than one way, leaving behind not certainty but competing theories. Other nations watched these American efforts with interest, for they showed that private determination could stand alongside imperial ambition. Britain had sent wave after wave of naval searches, while Grinnell's private funding allowed the United States to place its own name in the annals of exploration. Yet unlike Britain, America did not pursue the Arctic as a matter of empire. Grinnell's motivation remained deeply personal, a testament to how individual obsession could ripple outward into a saga of endurance, discovery, and unanswered questions. Even after years of searching, the Arctic offered only fragments, leaving behind silence where certainty should have been. Grinnell himself never saw the icy graves or the skeletal remains, yet his name became forever tied to the search for Franklin. His funded expeditions expanded geographic knowledge of the far north and brought home survivors who had tested the limits of human endurance. But the very heart of the mystery remained sealed, as if the Arctic itself allowed only glimpses of truth before closing its hand again. It was said that the ice had spoken once, through graves and bones, and then grown silent, as though determined to keep the rest of its secrets hidden forever. The Jeannette Expedition, 1879. The Jeannette set out beneath skies that glittered with summer light, as though nothing could touch her hull of oak and iron. She was outfitted in San Francisco under the command of George Washington DeLong, a naval officer who had already tested himself in Arctic waters, backed by newspaper magnate James Gordon Bennett Jr., who had first dreamed up the expedition. The ship carried not just provisions and crew, but also the weight of a theory. Scientists and sponsors alike believed in the existence of a navigable polar sea beyond the Bering Strait, warmed by ocean currents and awaiting discovery. For America, this voyage was a chance to plant its flag deeper into the Arctic map, a step toward prestige in an age when exploration was still tied to national pride. What looked straightforward on a map became treacherous in reality. Navigators traced a clear path from the Pacific northward, hoping that the Caraci current would funnel warmth toward the pole, opening a passage that ships could follow. The promise was seductive, for if the route existed, the Jeannette would not only reach higher latitudes than any vessel before her, but also prove a theory that had obsessed geographers for decades. De Long, though cautious by nature, carried that vision in his logbooks, confident that he had the resources and the resolve to test the dream. The crew of 33 men set out with optimism, their ship heavy with coal, food and instruments, meant to capture both data and glory. The trap closed quickly. Within months of leaving port in 1879, the Jeannette found herself gripped by heavy pack ice north of Siberia. There was no channel leading to open seas, no current sweeping them toward freedom, only an immovable wall that locked the ship in place. At first, the crew reassured themselves that it was temporary, that a shift of the wind would break them free, but as weeks turned into months, they realized they were prisoners. The Jeannette was no longer a ship of discovery, but a wooden island drifting at the mercy of the ice. Even in confinement, the Arctic revealed itself in strange beauty. Auroras shimmered across the night sky, green and violet curtains above men huddled in frostbitten tents of canvas and snow. For a moment the heavens mocked their suffering with splendour, a reminder that the same world that starved them could also stun them into silence. Meals became rituals, and rituals became lifelines. The men kept watches, repaired clothing, and rationed food while the ship creaked beneath pressure ridges that rose around her like frozen battlements. De Long encouraged journals, sketches, and scientific notes, determined that their confinement would not render the voyage meaningless. They hunted when they could, trading bullets for polar bears or seals to vary their diet. Yet beneath the surface routines lay unease. The ice drifted them westward, far from their intended route, and the knowledge that the ship could be crushed at any moment gnawed silently at the crew's confidence. The sound was like thunder, but it came from beneath their feet. In June 1881, the pressure of the ice proved too great, and the Jeannette splintered under the strain. Timbers cracked, decks gave way, and seawater flooded in faster than the pumps could keep up. De Long ordered men to salvage everything possible from scientific instruments to hardtack and rifles, piling supplies onto sledges and boats hauled onto the ice. The Jeannette sank, leaving the crew stranded on drifting floes, their lifeline to the world swallowed in a matter of hours. Now, the Arctic itself dictated the terms of survival, and every step would be paid for in sweat, frostbite, and dwindling hope. Among their burdens, the scientific instruments seemed both absurd and essential. Sextants, thermometers, and barometers clattered beside rifles and food tins, symbols of De Long's insistence that the expedition should still contribute to knowledge. Even as hunger gnawed their stomachs, the men measured, noted, and recorded, unwilling to let despair erase the purpose that had first carried them north. Frost gnawed at skin, and exhaustion bent every step. For weeks the men dragged their loads across hummocks of jagged ice, attempting to reach open water where their small boats could carry them toward the Siberian coast. Starvation threatened as rations shrank, and cold seeped through layers of wool and fur until it became a constant ache. 3 groups formed when the party split into boats, each led by officers who clung to their orders yet knew the odds were cruelly against them. Waves, fog, and storms battered the tiny craft, scattering them across the desolate Arctic seas. Not all 3 boats would share the same fate. One managed to reach the Siberian mainland and eventually brought survivors to safety. Another was swallowed by storms, disappearing without a trace. The third, De Long's, would limp toward the Lena Delta, where hope proved more dangerous than the seas they had just crossed. A logbook found years later carried the last words of De Long's hope. His group, numbering more than a dozen men, made landfall on the Lena Delta, one of the harshest and most desolate places in Siberia. Starving, soaked, and unable to find rescue, they built makeshift shelters out of driftwood and tried to wait for help. De Long wrote in his journal until his hand could no longer grip the pencil, chronicling the deaths of his men one by one. When rescuers finally arrived, months too late, they found frozen bodies and scattered belongings. but the journals preserved the final voice of the captain who had refused to stop recording even as death closed in. Years later, wreckage from the Jeannette was found thousands of miles away, drifting into the North Atlantic by way of polar currents. That discovery proved that ice could carry objects, and perhaps even ships, across the top of the world, a revelation that would later inspire new Arctic expeditions and fresh mysteries. What remains of the Jeannette now is not just her wreckage, but the silence of the ice that still holds her secrets. The Greely Expedition, 1881. According to official orders issued by the United States Army, the Lady Franklin Bay expedition was to be a mission of science. Led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, 25 men sailed north in 1881 under the framework of the First International Polar Year, an unprecedented cooperative effort where nations sent teams into the Arctic to collect magnetic, tidal, and meteorological data. Their post was to be established at Lady Franklin Bay on the northeastern coast of Ellesmere Island, a site that would allow them to gather information from one of the most remote outposts on Earth. It was presented as a mission of discipline and precision, framed more as a contribution to knowledge than as a race for territory. At the outset, there was confidence that this endeavour would succeed, where earlier quests for exploration had faltered. The Greely party carried the latest instruments for recording atmospheric pressure, ice movements, and magnetic variation supplied by Washington with promises of relief ships in consecutive summers. The men, many drawn from the regular army, were not adventurers but soldiers trained to follow orders and maintain structure even under duress. For the United States, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that it could compete with the seasoned polar efforts of Britain and other European powers, all while adding prestige to the nation's scientific standing. Greely's own journal reveals the strict patterns he imposed on camp life once the station was established at Fort Conger. Each man was assigned to routine observations every hour of the day and night, regardless of blizzards or freezing darkness. The records they produced filled page after page, a continuous chronicle of the Arctic's silence and violence. But between the data entries, other voices emerged. Private journals and sketches that spoke of isolation, personality clashes, and the strain of endless night. While Greely valued discipline, his men often viewed his severity as inflexibility, and the rift between commander and crew deepened with time. One by one, the relief ships failed to reach them. In 1882 and again in 1883, vessels sent to resupply Fort Conger turned back when the pack ice proved impenetrable. Promises from Washington dissolved into silence, leaving the men to calculate dwindling rations against the long winters. They clung to hope that the next thaw would bring sails on the horizon, but each summer ended with nothing more than shifting floes and empty seas. The expedition, meant to last only a year, now faced an uncertain future with no guarantee of contact from the outside world. Rumours of what might have happened to the relief ships reached them only through imagination. The men speculated endlessly, wondering if ice had destroyed the vessels or if bureaucratic delays in Washington had sealed their fate. Each theory only deepened the sense of abandonment, for they could not know whether they had been forgotten, sacrificed, or simply trapped by forces beyond human control. That uncertainty proved more corrosive than the cold itself, eating away at morale while the Arctic closed its grip around them. Within the camp, tempers fractured under the weight of hunger and confinement. Greely's military approach demanded absolute obedience, but the men grew restless and resentful. Punishments were severe for perceived slights or lapses in duty, and several accounts describe arguments that escalated into threats of violence. Even the act of recording weather became an ordeal when frostbitten fingers could scarcely grip a pencil. What had begun as a scientific outpost turned into a pressure chamber, with discipline pressed hard against despair. The journal entries of Sergeant David Brainerd capture the quiet unravelling with stark detail. His careful notes on temperature and tides give way to observations about men too weak to rise from their bunks, about quarrels that flared over scraps of food, and about the eerie silence when once strong voices fell quiet forever. In his writing, the expedition feels less like a military post and more like a slow procession into emptiness, with each death recorded as another step deeper into the Arctic's unyielding shadow. When the animals vanished, hope followed. Seals no longer surfaced near the shore, and polar bears kept their distance, depriving the camp of the fresh meat that had once supplemented their stores. With rations reduced to crumbs and scraps of tinned food, weakness spread quickly. Men staggered as they attempted their duties, and the cold seeped into their bones no matter how tightly they wrapped themselves in wool and fur. Every day the camp became quieter, its routines slowing under the weight of starvation. Discipline turned into desperation when Greely ordered a retreat from Fort Conger in August 1883. His decision to move southward in small boats was a gamble, taken because orders required him to head toward the relief point if supplies failed to arrive. The journey was brutal, with men forced to haul their craft across shifting ice, losing precious food along the way. Some deserted in search of better chances of survival, and when Private Charles Henry was caught stealing from the already scant supplies, Greely ordered his execution by firing squad. The journals record this moment in terse, haunted words, a sign that the line between order and collapse had been crossed. Whispers of cannibalism emerged from the ruins of that winter. Later investigations found human bones among the remains of campfires, some marked with knife cuts that suggested desperate measures had been taken. Survivors denied the practice, claiming their comrades had perished naturally and were buried with respect, but the evidence sparked outrage and suspicion back home. Official inquiries could not silence the rumours, and the expedition's reputation became clouded by the possibility that starvation had driven men past unthinkable limits. By the time rescuers arrived in June 1884, only 6 men remained alive out of the original 25. They were skeletal, scarcely able to move, their clothes in tatters and their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Lieutenant Greely himself was found close to death, still clinging to the remnants of command. The rescuers described a camp littered with frozen bodies, scattered journals, and the last remnants of supplies measured down to crumbs. The sight was so grim that even seasoned Arctic sailors struggled to comprehend the scale of suffering that had taken place in silence. Back in the United States, public reaction veered wildly between horror and admiration. Newspapers splashed headlines about the execution of a thief, the starvation of disciplined soldiers, and the unsettling hints of cannibalism. Yet alongside the scandal came a wave of reverence for the survivors who had endured what seemed impossible. The Greely expedition was remembered not just as a story of failure, but as proof of how far men could be pushed before the limits of human endurance gave way. What endures today are fragments: Greely's journal, private diaries, scientific records, and the testimony of survivors pieced together like shards of broken glass. They provide evidence of extraordinary endurance and bitter collapse, of knowledge gained at a cost so high it overshadowed the science itself. Historians still debate the balance between Greely's discipline and the desperation of his men, and the unanswered questions of their final months remain tangled in the evidence. The silence in those pages remains heavier than any verdict. The Italia airship crash, 1928. It begins with the sight of a massive silver airship drifting above the Arctic, its curved frame reflecting the pale sun as though it belonged to another world. Known as the Italia, it carried General Umberto Nobile and his crew northward from Svalbard on an expedition that sought both glory and knowledge. The sight was majestic, but underneath that spectacle rested a fragile machine of stitched fabric, gas cells, and hope. Others later described the departure as strangely quiet, the onlookers standing on shore with expressions that mixed pride with unease. They had reason to doubt. Only a year earlier, Nobile had commanded another flight over the North Pole in the airship Norgay, but the Italia was smaller, weaker, and less suited to storms. Even before the disaster struck, a mood of uncertainty seemed to cling to the vessel as it drifted into the mist. From official logs, the mission at first unfolded with confidence. The airship crossed the Arctic Ocean, its crew recording data and photographing vast fields of ice that stretched endlessly below. Yet between the crisp entries of altitude, temperature, and wind speed, there is no mention of what it felt like to look down into that frozen emptiness, where no trail of survival could ever be left. In those unspoken gaps rests the true scale of the risk they carried. When the crash finally came, it arrived not as a single blow but as a chain of events that collided in cruel succession. Thick ice fog blinded visibility, the wind battered the vessel, and the controls failed to keep the fragile frame stable. The Italia struck the ice north of Spitsbergen with a sound that several survivors later described as both sharp and endless. like the tearing of metal that never seemed to stop. In an instant, the ship broke apart, casting men and supplies across the frozen expanse. In the wreckage, survival turned from theory into nightmare. A red tent salvaged from the remains became their shelter. The image of that tent against the infinite whiteness remains one of the most haunting symbols of Arctic exploration. Within its canvas walls, men nursed injuries, shared dwindling rations, and waited for a rescue that might never come. Every breath of wind against the fabric reminded them of the thinness of the barrier between life and the void. At the same time, fragments of the airship drifted across the floes, some carried away by shifting ice, others sinking below the surface. Survivors later recalled watching sections of the wreck vanish piece by piece, as though the Arctic itself were erasing the evidence of their voyage. Those broken spars and torn fabric represented not only lost supplies, but also the slow disappearance of their last tangible link to the world beyond the ice. Across Europe, the world followed the unfolding drama through radio reports and newspaper headlines. Each new transmission sent from the survivors' wireless crackled with urgency, though often it faded into static before the message was complete. The uncertainty magnified the sense of helplessness, as families and governments tried to piece together fragments of information into a coherent story. What was clear was that men were stranded somewhere in the Arctic, and time was slipping away. Search efforts soon expanded beyond Italy. Norway, Sweden, the Soviet Union, and even private adventurers joined the hunt. The Arctic became a stage where politics, pride, and desperation collided. For some rescuers, helping Nobile was a matter of national duty. For others, it was a chance to prove their own reach into the polar frontier. Yet despite the flurry of ships and aircraft, the ice swallowed their progress with indifference. One of the most striking turns in the story came with the involvement of Roald Amundsen, the legendary Norwegian explorer. Hearing of the stranded men, he volunteered to join the rescue and set off by plane from Tromsø. His decision seemed to echo a pattern of Arctic expeditions, where one crisis drew in another, creating new mysteries rather than resolving the old. Amundsen's plane never returned, disappearing into the Arctic fog without a trace. In seeking to save lives, he himself became another name lost to the ice. From the moment his plane disappeared, rumours spread with unusual speed, filling newspapers with speculation. Some insisted Amundsen's aircraft had gone down in the Barents Sea, while others believed it had reached as far as Franz Josef Land. Search attempts turned up nothing, and in time the silence surrounding his fate became its own unsolved chapter in Arctic history. That silence amplified the sense that the Italia disaster had drawn into its orbit not just the lives of its own crew, but also one of the greatest explorers the world had ever known. Back on the drifting floes, the men beneath the red tent endured a blur of hunger and frostbite. Their radio became both lifeline and torment, each message a plea hurled into an atmosphere that sometimes answered only hissed. The knowledge that rescue parties were searching yet failing cut as deeply as the cold itself. At times, survivors wrote of listening for the sound of engines above the horizon, a sound that usually never came. The eventual rescue, when it came, arrived in fragments rather than triumph. Some men were found and pulled from the ice, while others perished in the wait. Nobile himself was saved, but the aftermath brought controversy. Critics accused him of abandoning his men by allowing himself to be rescued first, while defenders argued that his removal allowed the mission to continue. The question of his responsibility lingered like the fog that had swallowed both his airship and Amundsen's plane. After the survivors returned to Europe, the story still refused to settle. Testimonies clashed, accusations surfaced, and political rivalries deepened. What happened inside the red tent during those long weeks became a matter of debate rather than certainty. Some spoke of courage and cooperation, others whispered of division, blame and despair. The truth lay buried beneath memory, pride and silence. Even modern historians find themselves navigating a maze of contradictions. Diaries conflict with radio logs, and survivors' later interviews often diverge from their initial reports. The deeper one reads into the testimony, the more the narrative frays, leaving gaps that no amount of documentation can mend. Instead of a single story, the Italia leaves behind a tangle of overlapping accounts that resist resolution, much like the drifting ice that never settles into one form. In the decades since, fragments of the Italia have been recovered from the ice, pieces of metal twisted by the crash and weathered by time. Each recovery adds to the physical evidence yet never completes the story. Objects cannot answer the questions left behind by human voices that cut off mid-sentence in the static of a failing radio. The remains speak only of impact, not of the thoughts and fears that filled the hours in the red tent. What lingers most is the image of the airship itself, rising with promise and vanishing in fragments across the Arctic, a reminder of how fragile human ambition becomes when set against the frozen silence of the polar sky. And somewhere beyond the edges of history, the sound of an unanswered transmission seems to echo, carrying a question that still has no reply. The Hansa Expedition, 1869. The harbour lay quiet as the Hansa prepared to sail, its decks loaded with ambition and supplies. She was one of 2 ships chosen for the German North Polar Expedition of 1869, a mission intended to explore the eastern coast of Greenland. The companion vessel, Germania, carried the scientific leadership and much of the expedition's prestige, but the Hansa was no less important. Under Captain Paul Hegemann, the crew believed they would map uncharted stretches of Arctic coastline and return home as pioneers who had expanded Germany's reach into the frozen frontier. Where the Germania found open water, the Hansa met only walls of ice. Soon after leaving port, the 2 vessels were separated by dense floes that drifted and closed like shifting fortresses. Signals grew faint, then vanished, and the distance widened until the crews realized there would be no reunion. The Germania pressed on with her scientific work, but the Hansa, trapped by currents, faced a different fate altogether. Isolation had fallen swiftly, and with it came the first shadow of uncertainty. Ice closed around the hull, locking timbers in a grip no anchor could resist. The crew waited for a thaw or a shift in the pack, but the floes pressed tighter, as if the ship had stumbled into the jaws of something alive. The sails sagged uselessly, and the rudder offered no power. Each day the pressure grew, accompanied by sharp reports from the wood below decks, until men whispered that they were no longer on a ship, but inside a coffin of oak pinned against the Arctic's will. The groan of shifting floes replaced the sound of the sea, becoming the crew's constant backdrop. With provisions enough to last for many months, they began the routine of survival, hunting when the weather allowed, repairing worn boots and coats, and rationing coal so that heat would not vanish before winter had passed. Though Hegemann remained calm, others noted how the endless creaking and rumbling around them gnawed at the nerves, an unrelenting reminder that the ship was no longer master of her voyage. The floe beneath their feet seemed alive, cracking and drifting as if it had its own will. The Hansa became less a vessel and more an island carried wherever the ice chose, sliding steadily southward away from Greenland's coast. The ship's lanterns flickered against walls of ice that towered like ramparts, and men wondered whether they were prisoners of a drifting fortress. What little control they had was reduced to observation, noting bearings in their journals while the Arctic moved them farther from any known route. By November, the ship itself was gone, crushed and swallowed by the pack. The timbers splintered, water rushed in, and within hours the Hansa sank beneath the floe, leaving only fragments of masts jutting through the ice. Supplies and tools were hastily pulled onto the frozen surface, where the crew built makeshift stores and considered their next step. To be stranded on drifting ice without a ship was to stare directly at death, and yet, in that moment, the men resolved not to yield to it. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks blurred into months, with little to measure except the sun's low arc. Shelters were constructed from planks salvaged from the wreck, insulated with snow blocks until they resembled huts pressed into the floe itself. Coal was burned sparingly, and fires sputtered against the bitter cold, but the air within remained barely tolerable. Each dawn brought the same view of white horizons and black water fissures, a landscape so featureless that time seemed to pause altogether. A scrap of woolen cloth nailed against the ice wall served as a curtain, a fragile attempt at privacy. Inside, men shared cramped quarters where every cough echoed and every gesture carried weight. The smell of seal-fat lamps clung to their clothing, and frost decorated the walls with intricate patterns that glistened like cruel reminders of the cold pressing in from all sides. Still, they found ways to endure, sewing, reading what little they had brought, and keeping meticulous notes of their strange drift across the Greenland Sea. Hunting became both salvation and ordeal. When seals surfaced at breathing holes, men crept forward with rifles, their breath freezing in the air as they aimed. A successful shot meant meat, blubber for lamps and skins for warmth. A missed attempt meant another day of gnawing hunger. Polar bears appeared at times, circling the camp, their massive forms silhouetted against the ice. To kill one was to buy a week of food and protection, but to fail was to risk mauling. Each encounter felt like a contest between desperation and survival. Supplies dwindled, and the sea showed no mercy. The drift carried them southward toward waters patrolled by icebergs that rose like cathedrals, silent and ominous. Storms swept across the floe, tearing at their shelters and scattering belongings. More than once, cracks split the ice beneath them, forcing the men to haul provisions quickly from one fragment to another, as though they were nomads living on a surface that could vanish overnight. Every shift of the floe brought with it the possibility that the entire camp might disintegrate without warning. Yet even amid collapse, small sparks of hope appeared. Once, drifting close to the coast of Greenland, they spotted dark land in the distance, but the ice refused to grant them passage. Another time, hunters returned with a haul of seals so large that for a brief period they ate until full, forgetting the ache of hunger that had become constant. These moments did not erase despair, but they reminded the men that survival was still within reach, if only they endured a little longer. By the summer of 1870, their ordeal had stretched into a full year. Beards had grown wild, clothes were patched beyond recognition, and faces bore the deep lines of cold and fatigue. But the drift, as relentless as it was, had also carried them closer to shipping lanes, where rescue might be possible. With the first signs of thinning ice, they prepared small boats built from the wreckage of the Hansa, lashing them together with ropes and sealing gaps with whatever scraps they could find. It was a desperate craft, but it offered movement where the floe had denied them. When at last the ice released them, they pushed off into open water with trembling hands on oars. The sea stretched vast and uncertain, but the men rowed with a mixture of fear and determination. Days of rowing followed, interrupted by squalls that drenched them, and nights when exhaustion threatened to drag them into the waves. Still they pressed forward, guided by the faint hope that land or a passing vessel might appear before strength gave out entirely. Rescue finally came when they reached the coast of Greenland, where they encountered settlements that could offer aid. Against the odds, nearly all of the Hansa crew survived, carried southward by the very ice that had seemed determined to destroy them. Journals, reports and relics of the journey later made their way back to Europe, where the ordeal was recorded as one of both suffering and resilience. Not only does the memory of survival linger, but also the silence of the ice that erased the Hansa from sight. The Edward Belcher Expedition, 1852. 45 days trapped in ice, no sign of the Franklin men. This brief entry, scribbled in the log of HMS Assistance, captures the uncertainty that hung over Edward Belcher's Arctic mission from the outset. Backed by the British Admiralty, Belcher set out in 1852 with 5 ships, charged not only with exploring uncharted waters, but with finding Franklin's lost expedition. Yet the icy expanse proved less a route to discovery than a theatre of unpredictability, where every decision echoed in the hollow silence of frozen seas. Why did Belcher divide his fleet into separate search parties? The question would haunt officers and historians alike. 4 ships ventured across the channels of Wellington Strait and Peel Sound, each hoping to locate survivors or trace the trail of Franklin. Orders meant clarity instead of inviting confusion. Signals were misread, and drifting ice forced unintended separations. What seemed a precise plan became a fractured attempt at exploration, and the Arctic's vast white expanse swallowed both men and strategy. Expectations collided with reality at every turn. The Assistance and the Resolute found themselves frozen near Beechy Island, the same grave-strewn land that had offered the first confirmation of Franklin's fate. Men wrote in journals of unbroken days of light and unyielding ice, yet the triumph of discovery was tempered by frostbite, scurvy, and the quiet terror of isolation. Every glance across the frozen waters reminded them that nature held the ultimate authority, indifferent to human intent or preparation. Supplies running low, morale faltering. This fragment, discovered decades later in an officer's diary, reveals the anxiety behind the stoic reports sent home. Belcher himself faced growing criticism from subordinate captains, who questioned his judgment and the division of ships. Tension simmered not just from cold and hunger, but from fractured leadership, leaving men uncertain whom to trust. Even routine observations of ice conditions carried weight, for any miscalculation could mean entrapment or worse. 10 men were lost in a single blizzard. The official logs are terse, reporting only that boats went missing while attempting reconnaissance, yet letters from surviving officers hint at near-tragic errors, misjudged ice flows, equipment left behind, and poor visibility that transformed mundane tasks into life-threatening risks. Conflicting accounts cloud the events. Some saw this as an unavoidable tragedy, others as evidence of mismanagement. The true story remains suspended between testimony and conjecture. Was the decision to abandon the ships inevitable? In April 1854, Belcher made the fateful call to leave 4 of the 5 vessels behind, burning them to prevent their capture by shifting ice. Critics later argued that abandonment was premature, yet contemporary reports highlight the pressing danger. Timber cracked, ice pressed relentlessly, and the men risked entrapment. The burning ships left only the Resolute to carry the fleet's reputation and crew back to safety, an act both heroic and hauntingly final. Each officer recorded different impressions of the Arctic's dominion. Lieutenant William Hoskins noted, "A landscape both cruel and magnificent," while Captain Henry Kellett described icefields as walls of frozen glass that trap the unwary. Discrepancies in narrative extended beyond style. Measurements, compass readings, and even the locations of campsites occasionally conflicted. The maps they produced stitched together multiple voices, yet gaps persisted, reminding future explorers and historians that certainty in these regions was a rare commodity. Fear and hope interwove as men scanned the horizon for signs of Franklin. Snowdrifts concealed potential survivors, and every odd shape on the ice sparked speculation. Belcher's crews wrote of fleeting hopes dashed by empty landscapes, footprints that ended abruptly, sledges left abandoned, and traces of human activity that vanished without explanation. The Arctic here became a character in its own right, silent, patient, and occasionally cruel. The survivors' journals speak of an eerie rhythm, long watches under endless daylight, punctuated by sudden storms, ice pressure, and the occasional bear. Men recorded conversations with peers and Inuit guides, some of whom offered advice or warnings later dismissed by officers. Belcher's interpretation of local knowledge was cautious, and at times reliance on European methods over indigenous guidance may have narrowed the expedition's options. Each decision, small or large, carried immense weight, yet the consequences often remained invisible until it was too late. Reports sent home vacillated between triumph and disaster. Admiralty notices praised the fleet for gathering significant geographical data, while private letters criticised the handling of ships and personnel. When the surviving men returned to England, the nation celebrated the endurance displayed, yet whispered about the lost ships, the burned vessels, and the dangers so narrowly survived. Official histories sought to impose coherence, but the Arctic's inherent unpredictability ensured that a complete understanding remained out of reach. The resolution of Belcher's mission was further complicated by disputes over command and credit. Officers differed in their recollections, some portraying Belcher as decisive and brave, others as overly cautious or rigid. Contemporary journals, letters, and reports all leave small contradictions. A sledging route taken on one day may differ between accounts. A storm described as minor by one may be catastrophic to another. These inconsistencies form a lattice of uncertainty, reinforcing the expedition's enigmatic character. Artifacts later recovered hint at silent struggles endured on the ice. Pieces of equipment, partially melted flags, and notes frozen into blocks of ice provide tantalizing but fragmentary testimony of what occurred in unrecorded hours. They suggest improvisation, adaptation, and moments of both ingenuity and desperation. Yet they reveal little of the decisions that led to the abandonment of ships or the near disasters avoided through quick thinking, leaving questions that can never be fully answered. Belcher's personal reflection, recorded in his final log entries, suggests a man caught between duty and the unpredictability of nature. We have measured, we have mapped, yet the Arctic remains unconquered. His words do not recount heroics in a straightforward narrative. They admit uncertainty, the frustration of incomplete knowledge, and the quiet terror that comes from staring into icebound emptiness. The expedition's legacy lies not in a single achievement but in its testimony to the limitations of human command against the vast, indifferent Arctic. Survival and return demanded ingenuity. Crews used sledges to carry abandoned supplies, adapted tents and cabins for makeshift winter quarters, and rationed meagre food reserves. Men endured frostbite, scurvy, and the ever-present risk of falling through ice. Each step forward on frozen terrain became a small victory against nature, yet every victory carried the haunting awareness that at any moment the Arctic could obliterate months of planning, effort, and endurance. Maps and reports pieced together afterward reveal the complexity of the mission, but gaps remain. Coordinates differ slightly, weather descriptions contradict, and interpretations of ice behaviour vary. This patchwork reinforces the sense that the Arctic allows only partial knowledge, glimpses of events, fragments of decision-making, but never the whole truth. Modern historians rely on cross-referencing these fragments, yet even this meticulous effort cannot resolve every question. Through letters and testimony, the human cost emerges clearly. Men suffered silently, their private journals revealing fear, doubt, and exhaustion. Some officers attempted to enforce discipline, others struggled under it. Survival depended on cooperation, yet tension remained, amplified by extreme cold and isolation. The psychological burden of Arctic exploration left scars that lasted long after return, emphasizing the thin line between bravery and recklessness. While Belcher himself never found Franklin, his expedition revealed vast stretches of the Canadian Arctic, aiding future navigation and search efforts. The legacy is both scientific and enigmatic, a blend of achievement and mystery. While some ships returned, others were lost to fire or ice, leaving physical reminders of peril and the high cost of exploration. Despite all the detailed logs, maps, and artifacts, the Edward Belcher expedition resists tidy storytelling. The Arctic's silence preserves more than geography. It preserves uncertainty. Researchers can trace the route, examine the journals, and reconstruct incidents, yet something essential remains elusive. Each attempt to fully understand the expedition encounters the same problem. The ice holds its secrets as tightly as it ever did. Even after nearly 2 centuries, the frozen channels, abandoned ships, and scattered journals hint at lives lived on the edge, decisions made in darkness, and dangers that were only partially recorded. In that endless expanse, the Arctic seems to wait, holding secrets that might never be uncovered. The Ziegler Polar Expedition, 1903. The ship pushed through a shattered expanse of sea ice, its hull groaning under the pressure of frozen ridges that rose like jagged teeth. The men of the Ziegler Polar Expedition, led by the wealthy industrialist and Arctic enthusiast Anthony F. Ziegler, gazed at the horizon where ice met sky, knowing that every mile forward carried them deeper into an environment both majestic and indifferent. Their goal was the North Pole, a prize still largely theoretical and mapped only in conjecture. Yet the Arctic seemed determined to test them from the very outset. Ziegler's ambition had been fueled by the recent flurry of polar exploration at the turn of the century. The North Pole had become a stage for nations and private patrons alike, yet few understood the brutal realities awaiting those who ventured beyond known channels. Funding a crew of skilled sailors, scientists and surveyors, Ziegler sought to push farther than any American expedition before him, blending daring with methodical planning. The hope was that careful preparation could overcome the merciless Arctic, though history suggested otherwise. A relentless wind cut across the ice fields as the expedition's sledges were unloaded for the first survey trek. Equipment, provisions, and scientific instruments were hauled across hummocks of ice that glistened in sunlight and shadow alike. The explorers recorded every feature, from the depth of frozen ridges to the angle of drifting snow, aware that each observation could inform future navigation or save lives. Even as they mapped these details, the Arctic refused to reveal all, offering glimpses of beauty alongside silent threats. Storms arrived without warning, turning the sky into a low-hanging ceiling of grey and white. Visibility vanished, leaving only the sound of shifting ice and the occasional crack that echoed across the plains. Men huddled together in temporary shelters, knowing that the environment could be as deadly as any foe. Morale was tested as hours stretched into days, and the expedition learned quickly that endurance was as much mental as it was physical. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper the unspoken truth of the Arctic. Only those who respected it could hope to survive. Despite these challenges, the crew uncovered subtle signs that the region held secrets waiting to be documented. Geological formations suggested shifts in ice and land that had not appeared on any previous map, while skeletal remains of fauna hinted at survival strategies long abandoned. The men catalogued each find meticulously, aware that even minor discoveries contributed to the broader understanding of a polar world largely untouched by human hands. Yet each revelation was accompanied by the unshakable reminder that isolation could render even the most careful expedition vulnerable. As days blended into weeks, the monotony of snow and ice was broken by moments of peril. A sledge team slipped through a concealed crevasse, plunging supplies into the freezing depths below. Quick thinking and sheer strength saved lives, yet the incident left a lingering fear among the men. Beneath the white surface lay hazards invisible until it was nearly too late. Every step thereafter carried caution, a delicate balance between progress and survival. The logistical complexity of the expedition became increasingly apparent as rations dwindled. Fresh provisions were scarce, and reliance on limited hunting made each meal a calculated endeavour. Even experienced guides grew wary, their knowledge of the terrain challenged by unpredictable ice flows. The Arctic dictated the rhythm of life aboard the ship and on the ice, bending human schedules to its frozen will and reminding every man of the fragility of their undertaking. Scientific observations, however, remained a steady focus. Meteorological readings, ice thickness measurements, and magnetic surveys were documented with precision. These records promised to extend knowledge of the Arctic for generations, yet they also underscored the difficulty of understanding a region that seemed determined to obscure its patterns. Each charted anomaly hinted at forces larger than the expedition itself, forces that could not be controlled or predicted. The psychological toll on the crew was evident in subtle ways. Conversations grew terse, and moments of hesitation stretched longer as men weighed each action against potential danger. Trust, once assumed, had to be earned daily in a landscape that tolerated no error. Leaders balanced encouragement with caution, yet even the most measured orders could be overshadowed by the harsh reality of ice and wind. The Arctic was a teacher whose lessons were learned only through suffering and observation. Interactions with local Inuit guides provided glimpses of survival wisdom that the crew could not ignore. Hunters shared techniques for traversing thin ice and recognizing weather patterns invisible to the untrained eye. Yet even with guidance, every expedition member understood that knowledge alone could not defeat the environment. Adaptation and respect were as necessary as maps and instruments, and the men began to internalize the lesson that nature, not ambition, set the true limits of achievement. Midway through the expedition, unexpected ice shifts forced a rerouting of sledging paths. Teams were compelled to abandon carefully planned routes and improvise, navigating through uncharted terrain. Each decision was weighted by the potential consequences of delay, exposure, and scarcity of resources. The Arctic had made clear that control was an illusion and that the only constant was vigilance. As the months progressed, minor successes offered fleeting relief. Small discoveries, an unrecorded island, a frozen inlet, evidence of previous expeditions, provided the crew with a sense of accomplishment. Yet each achievement was tempered by the ever-present risk of disaster. The Arctic allowed only glimpses of triumph before reminding explorers of its vast, unyielding power. In the final phase, exhaustion and frostbite claimed strength from even the most resolute men. The expedition had survived storms, shifting ice, and scarcity, yet the relentless cold and isolation exacted a toll that was impossible to quantify. Each day required deliberate effort to maintain both body and morale, and every morning carried the quiet fear of unseen hazards. Despite these trials, the crew's meticulous records endured, preserving knowledge that would guide future explorers. When rescue and return finally arrived, the expedition's achievements were measured not solely by distance or mapping, but by endurance and documentation. Ziegler's investment and foresight had yielded scientific contributions of lasting significance, though the Arctic remained, as ever, a place of unanswered questions. The expedition had ventured into the unknown, captured fragments of insight, and yet the vastness of ice and sea ensured that mysteries persisted beyond reach. Years later, scholars and explorers would study the charts and journals left behind, piecing together routes and observations that clarified some uncertainties but left others intact. Each entry reflected a combination of human curiosity and environmental dominance, the tension between ambition and the Arctic's indifferent power. The expedition had illuminated terrain, recorded anomalies, and preserved the lived reality of men confronting a world that defied full comprehension. As maps grew ever more precise and explorers' knowledge deepened, the Arctic continued to guard its surprises. Ice drifted, storms rose without warning, and crevasses remained hidden beneath fresh snow. The Ziegler polar expedition had demonstrated that human courage could measure itself against extreme conditions, but the environment itself remained the ultimate arbiter of fate. Beyond the limits of their meticulously charted routes, the Arctic held secrets that no expedition could completely reveal. The Crocker Land expedition, 1913. Could land truly exist where maps claimed only ice? The question drove Donald B. Macmillan and his team north from Ita, Greenland in the summer of 1913. Guided by the reports of Robert Peary, who had decades earlier hinted at a landmass beyond the ice fields, the expedition carried the weight of hope and skepticism alike. Financed by the American industrialist George Crocker, the journey promised prestige for the United States and an opportunity to chart an unknown corner of the Arctic. Yet it also promised frustration. The Arctic had a history of tricking even the most experienced explorers. The horizon shimmered in impossible patterns, teasing the eyes with shapes that might be mountains. Optical illusions known as mirages, common in polar regions, played tricks on the expedition's surveyors. Distant ridges appeared and vanished, and snowfields reflected the sunlight in ways that could mimic coastlines. Every sighting demanded verification, and Macmillan's team spent hours with compasses, sextants, and theodolites, measuring angles and distances while the cold gnawed at their fingers and their patience. Cold winds sliced across the sledges, carrying the faint scent of salt and snow that seemed to warn of hidden danger. Every crunch underfoot reminded men that the ice could give way without notice, swallowing weeks of careful planning in an instant. Conversations became clipped as the environment demanded attention, and even minor sounds, the snap of a brittle icicle or the distant groan of a pressure ridge, set nerves on edge. Each step was measured, a cautious negotiation with a world that offered both illusion and threat. Decades of Arctic exploration had taught men to trust instruments, yet the ice offered no certainty. Early in the journey, dogs and sledges strained over hidden crevasses, and even the most reliable compasses wavered under magnetic anomalies. Supplies had been calculated meticulously, but delays caused by harsh conditions threatened every ration. The expedition's survival depended not only on skill, but also on judgment in a landscape that refused to yield easily to human understanding. Surveyors adjusted their sledges as a sudden gust threatened to sweep their notes into the snow. The team pressed forward in pairs, leaving markers along the ice to track their route. Observers documented everything from shifting pressure ridges to the eerie stillness that sometimes descended over the frozen plains. Each day brought minor triumphs, new topographical data, glimpses of distant peaks, but these were tempered by uncertainty, for the land they sought might be a phantom conjured by reflections in the Arctic's strange light. Few expeditions had dared traverse northern Greenland, and none had reported the phantom land hinted at by Peary. Macmillan approached each sighting with cautious enthusiasm, balancing ambition against the memory of explorers who had been lost to the cold and the ice. The Arctic had long been a test not just of endurance, but of perception, and every misjudgment could prove fatal. The men learned to read the ice as much as they read maps, watching for pressure cracks, drift patterns, and signs of weather that might render a planned route impassable. Decades of Arctic lore amplified the stakes. Tales of explorers lost to unseen crevasses or swept away by sudden storms lingered in every mind, a reminder that ambition carried consequences as sharp as the ice itself. Even Peary's earlier accounts were filtered through layers of second-hand reports, leaving Macmillan's team to balance hope against skepticism. Every map consulted was partial, and every landmark noted might vanish as a trick of the light. The past seemed to whisper. Those who pressed too far risked vanishing from history entirely. Whispers among the men suggested both excitement and fear, for the line between hope and delusion was thin. Some claimed to see definite coastlines, jagged and rising from the horizon, while others insisted the shapes were optical tricks. Debate became routine around campfires, often interrupted by gusts that carried snow into their faces and obscured the very terrain under discussion. Confidence and doubt intertwined, and the psychological strain grew alongside the physical hardships of the journey. What appeared as a distant ridge could vanish by midday, leaving only questions in its wake. Snowstorms and whiteouts concealed features that had seemed clear the day before, forcing Macmillan to rely on careful triangulation and repeated observations. Even with methodical records, the team could not fully separate reality from illusion. It became clear that Crocker Land, if it existed, might be less a fixed destination than a symbol of the Arctic's capacity to mislead. Thermometers and compasses offered contradictory signals, fueling doubt about the reality of what they saw. Wind chill and rapidly changing temperatures forced constant adjustments, while ice conditions fluctuated unpredictably. Each measurement brought clarity only temporarily. As soon as a reading was taken, shifting ice and drifting fog erased the certainty it offered. For the expedition, the Arctic was a puzzle that could never be fully solved, each answer dissolving into new questions. Eyes strained against glare and drifting snow, struggling to reconcile reality with expectation. Shapes that appeared substantial dissolved into empty white by midday, and reflections on ice surfaces created phantom shadows that could mislead the unwary. Even seasoned guides questioned their own senses, relying on instinct as much as instruments. Sleep-deprived minds began to conflate past sightings with imagination, leaving men to wonder whether they chased land, or an Arctic mirage that existed only in collective desire. A false horizon led them to overestimate distances, straining both men and dogs unnecessarily. Supplies ran low, and the physical limits of both animals and humans were tested daily. Even experienced guides questioned the feasibility of continuing, but Macmillan pressed on, convinced that perseverance might reveal the land Peary had described. The tension between caution and ambition shaped every decision, leaving the men perpetually uncertain whether they chased discovery or illusion. The pursuit of discovery revealed more about human ambition than the Arctic itself. Personal journals, sketches, and meticulous reports documented the team's observations and interpretations, yet a sense of unease permeated every page. What was the value of findings if they could be disproved by the next gust of wind or the subtle shifting of ice? The Arctic demanded humility, and even a seasoned leader like Macmillan had to confront the possibility that his quarry was a ghost on the horizon. A blizzard descended with little warning, erasing tracks and confounding every calculation. Men huddled behind sledges, eyes straining to see through the swirling white. Messages sent across the ice to coordinate movements often failed, and the snow-concealed landmarks previously relied upon for navigation. In these moments, the expedition was suspended in a world where past and future blurred, leaving only the cold and the silence. Visible but never within reach, the shadow of Crocker Land hovered beyond the drifting ice. The Austro-Hungarian Tegethoff Expedition, 1872. The Arctic sky glimmered like fractured glass as the Tegethoff pushed through the first fields of broken ice, each crunch and grind echoing across the frozen sea. The men on deck watched the horizon with a mix of awe and trepidation, knowing that every mile forward drew them further from the comforts of Europe and deeper into a realm governed by forces beyond human control. The ship's polished hull and rigging contrasted sharply with the jagged whiteness that threatened to cleave her in two, and the vast silence seemed to amplify both ambition and fear. Austria-Hungary's imperial interests lent a weight to the expedition that extended beyond scientific discovery. Emperor Franz Joseph had sanctioned the voyage in part to showcase his empire's reach, while the crew carried instruments, maps, and letters that reflected the ambitions of diplomats and geographers alike. Each maneuver was more than navigation. It was a statement of national pride, an assertion that the Empire could stake a claim in the frozen expanses where few Europeans had ventured. Yet prestige carried with it the hidden threat of overreach, and the Arctic demanded respect from even the most disciplined mariners. Preparations aboard the Tegethoff had been meticulous. Every barrel of food, crate of scientific instruments, and coil of rope had been inspected and re-inspected, yet the ice proved an adversary with no regard for human foresight. Sailors struggled to maintain footing on frost-slicked decks, while officers recalculated courses in anticipation of pressure ridges that could appear without warning. The tension between careful planning and capricious nature was a constant presence, reminding all on board that control was provisional and that the Arctic's authority was absolute. A sudden crack split the still air one morning as the ship's prow struck a hidden ridge of ice. The vibration travelled through timbers and into the hearts of the crew, a reminder that danger lurked beneath the surface at every turn. Boats were readied for emergency evacuation, but the icy sea held the Tegethoff fast. The men moved with practiced efficiency, knowing that hesitation could turn a minor incident into a catastrophe, and the sound of splitting ice lingered as an unspoken warning of the fragility of even the strongest vessel. Scientific observation persisted amidst the peril. Meteorologists recorded temperatures, wind speeds, and cloud formations, while geologists noted the composition of exposed ice and rock. Each measurement, taken with precision and care, was a fragment of understanding in a landscape determined to resist comprehension. The juxtaposition of human order and environmental chaos was stark, with every observation reminding the crew that knowledge was both a shield and an acknowledgement of vulnerability. Stories of past expeditions circulated among the men, highlighting triumphs and failures alike. Sailors recalled the fates of earlier explorers such as Edward Belcher and Julius Payer, using these accounts to calibrate both hope and caution. The Arctic was a teacher that offered lessons only through experience, and every anecdote reinforced the invisible line separating preparation from calamity. History itself seemed to whisper through the ice, cautioning against arrogance and demanding attentiveness to subtle signs in wind, drift, and cloud. Days stretched into nights of white glare, the sun skimming the horizon in a low, unyielding arc. Fatigue seeped into muscles and minds, testing the discipline of even the most seasoned crew members. Small errors, a misjudged step, a slipped rope, could cascade into significant setbacks. Leaders worked to maintain focus and morale, alternating between orders and encouragement, while the Arctic itself seemed to watch and wait, indifferent to their presence and their purpose. The ice shifted unpredictably, forming ridges and leads that forced constant rerouting. Crews on sledges discovered areas of unstable snow covering hidden crevasses, where a misstep could mean a plunge into freezing depths. Every traversal required careful scanning, repeated probing, and cautious progress, reminding the men that the landscape was a labyrinth disguised as open space. Maps and instruments offered guidance, but the terrain was a living puzzle, altering itself in ways both subtle and violent. Encounters with wildlife provided fleeting relief and valuable insight. Polar bears patrolled distant ridges, foxes moved silently across snowfields, and the tracks of seals offered both sustenance and study. Observing these animals required patience and attention, revealing strategies for survival honed over millennia. Yet even these encounters underscored the Arctic's sovereignty. Humans were visitors, constrained by the rhythms of the ice and the seasons, never fully in command of their surroundings. Unexpected discoveries challenged expectations. Small islands of rock protruded from the ice, remnants of geological processes unrecorded in prior charts. Crevices revealed glimpses of glacial movement, while frozen channels hinted at waters that might have flowed centuries before. Each find reinforced the tension between curiosity and caution, offering tangible evidence of the environment's secrets, while simultaneously demonstrating the precariousness of human exploration in such remote and mutable territory. Critical decisions became daily trials. Leaders had to weigh progress against the preservation of life, balancing scientific ambition with the limits of endurance and available resources. Routes that seemed promising one day could become impassable the next, forcing improvisation and rapid judgment. The crew adapted, learning that flexibility and respect for the environment were as vital as skill and training. Each choice carried the weight of consequence, reinforcing the expedition's fragile position in the Arctic theatre. Time's passage brought both insight and despair. Weeks of continuous observation gradually enriched maps and records, yet the monotony of ice and wind tested spirits and stamina alike. The interplay of sunlight and shadow, the shifting clouds, and the subtle sounds of cracking ice became the markers of days rather than hours. Knowledge accumulated slowly, a measure of progress, while the omnipresent isolation reminded the men that the Arctic remained vast, unknowable, and unconquered. Near disasters were inevitable. A sudden storm once trapped the Tegethoff in a narrow channel, and the hull scraped dangerously against submerged ice. Crews braced for impact, wielding poles and ropes to keep the vessel from being torn apart. The tension was palpable. Every movement counted, and the Arctic seemed almost alive in its orchestration of threat and beauty. Surviving such events became both a test of skill and a meditation on human vulnerability. Persistence in scientific endeavour remained unwavering. Instruments were adjusted, observations repeated, and data meticulously recorded despite the hardships. Each measurement, each sketch, each entry in the ship's log was a small victory against the Arctic's tendency to obscure and confound. Knowledge became a lifeline, a claim to order in a landscape that continually threatened disorder and demanded vigilance at every turn. Unanswered questions lingered even as the expedition progressed. Ice flows revealed patterns that suggested unknown currents, and glimpses of distant peaks hinted at topography not yet mapped. Every insight invited further inquiry, reinforcing the reality that exploration in such regions was a dialogue with uncertainty. The Arctic held its answers close, revealing only enough to challenge, not to satisfy, human ambition. As the Tegethoff approached the limits of charted territory, the environment seemed to close in around the men. Ice stretched into infinity, storms gathered without warning, and the sky reflected the shifting moods of the Arctic itself. Every sighting and measurement was a reminder that the expedition's scope was both immense and constrained, ambitious yet perpetually at the mercy of forces beyond comprehension. The crew of the Tegethoff endured, recorded and observed, leaving behind a legacy of maps, notes and evidence that would guide future explorers. Yet the Arctic's true nature remained elusive. Glacial tongues shifted, leads opened and closed, and mysteries persisted beyond the reach of human perception. Even as the ship returned to safer waters, the shadows of the Arctic followed, hinting at truths and dangers that no expedition could ever fully claim. The lost Hudson's Bay Company ship Eddystone, 1815. The waters of Hudson Bay shimmered with a deceptive calm as the Eddystone prepared to depart York Factory in the spring of 1815. Icebergs drifted lazily across the horizon, and the low sun cast long shadows over the frozen edges of the bay. Mariners and clerks alike understood that these waters could transform from serene to deadly within hours, yet the promise of trade, fur, and adventure drew men to the decks of ships like the Eddystone, bound for the remote outposts of the Hudson's Bay Company. The Eddystone carried not only cargo of furs and supplies, but also letters, ledgers, and the aspirations of a company expanding into the far reaches of North America. Commanded by a seasoned captain whose name has been preserved in the archives, the vessel represented the culmination of careful planning and maritime expertise. The crew, drawn from ports across Britain and Canada, moved with practiced efficiency, each man aware that mistakes in these latitudes could cost lives. The departure was marked by a rhythm of bell chimes and shouted orders. Sails unfurled and caught the spring breeze, tugging the vessel away from the safety of the harbour. On shore, a handful of Hudson's Bay Company employees watched the ship shrink against the pale horizon, a mixture of hope and trepidation etched on their faces. Beyond the bay, the waters widened into an expanse where wind and ice dictated all movement, and even experienced sailors felt the uneasy pull of the unknown. Fog rose as the Eddystone moved northward, obscuring landmarks and compressing the world into shades of grey. The crew relied heavily on compasses, lead lines, and celestial observation to maintain course, yet the magnetic anomalies of the region made navigation perilous. Day by day the shoreline receded, leaving only the endless sweep of water punctuated by ice floes and the occasional seabird, a fragile reminder of life in an otherwise harsh expanse. Whispers of superstition travelled quietly through the ship. Sailors spoke of phantom sounds beneath the hull, of sudden cold spots where warmth should have prevailed, and of glimpses of strange shadows dancing across the fog. While some dismissed these as nerves or fatigue, others recorded the observations in journals with meticulous care. The Arctic and subarctic seas had long held a reputation for testing both courage and reason, and even the most disciplined minds found themselves unsettled. A sudden gale swept across the bay one afternoon, slamming against the rigging and hurling snow across the deck. The crew scrambled to secure cargo and tighten lines, their shouts swallowed by the roar of wind and water. In moments, the Eddystone pitched violently, ice scraping along her hull as the captain ordered a cautious tack. That night, with waves battering the ship and visibility near zero, the men took turns at watch, eyes straining for glimpses of hazards hidden within the shifting darkness. As the voyage progressed into more open water, icebergs drifted with the currents, massive and indifferent. The Eddystone navigated a labyrinth of frozen towers, at times passing so close that the scrape of ice against timbers could be heard over the wind. Every choice of direction carried weight. A single miscalculation could leave the ship trapped or shattered. The tension aboard the vessel was palpable, a mixture of professional focus and the unspoken fear of being lost to the vast northern waters. The Hudson Bay Company had prepared for emergencies, yet supplies were finite and the distances immense. Provisions were meticulously accounted for, and the crew rationed carefully, aware that relief might be weeks or months away. Fresh water was collected from melted ice, and careful watch was kept over cargo, for spoilage or loss could have cascading consequences. Even in moments of routine, the unpredictability of nature cast long shadows over the men's efforts. Communication with other outposts was tenuous. Word of weather or ice conditions from distant trading posts arrived slowly, often too late to influence immediate decisions. The captain relied on charts drawn from previous expeditions, yet these were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Every nautical mile covered was an exercise in judgment, balancing the urgency of commerce with the omnipresent threat of unseen dangers lurking beneath the water or hidden within drifting ice. During a week of unusually calm seas, strange formations appeared on the horizon. Some sailors believed them to be a distant land, others insisted they were illusions born from temperature inversions over ice. Arguments arose quietly among the officers, each weighing evidence from binoculars and compass bearings. Even as consensus was sought, the environment refused clarity, offering only fleeting glimpses of shape and form before obscuring them in mist. The psychological strain increased as the Eddystone pushed farther into isolation. Men spent long hours staring at the horizon, their minds attuned to every creak of timbers, every whisper of wind. Dreams and memories blurred with the monotony of deckwork and superstition intertwined with the practical knowledge of seamanship. Journals hinted at these tensions, noting both routine duties and small incidents of unaccountable fear. One morning, a sudden shift in current carried the Eddystone perilously close to a submerged reef. Only quick thinking prevented a collision, and the incident underscored the fragile margin between order and disaster. Sailors noted the subtle changes in watercolour and wave patterns, signs that had gone unnoticed until that critical moment. The episode reinforced the notion that mastery over the environment was temporary and precarious. Records from the Hudson Bay Company later reveal that sightings of the Eddystone grew sporadic. Traders and fishermen along the coast reported brief glimpses of a vessel matching her description, yet reports were inconsistent and often contradicted by weather patterns that would have made passage impossible. The trail grew cold as the ship pressed into less charted waters, leaving only hints of its presence for historians to piece together decades later. Rumours circulated of wreckage sighted along desolate stretches of coastline, but confirmation was rare. Driftwood and tattered sails suggested catastrophe, yet nothing definitively proved the fate of the Eddystone. Each account carried fragments of information that, while intriguing, only deepened the sense of mystery. Scholars and explorers in later years would debate the veracity of each sighting, the line between fact and conjecture blurred by time and distance. The Hudson Bay Company continued its operations, but the disappearance of the Eddystone left a gap in knowledge and supplies. Letters sent from intended ports never arrived, and subsequent ships reported no trace along the expected route. The company's archives preserved records of the cargo, crew lists, and instructions, yet these documents could not illuminate the ship's final course. Each unanswered question compounded the uncertainty surrounding its loss. Maritime historians later noted the conditions typical of the northern Atlantic in early summer 1815: shifting ice, sudden squalls, and fog banks that could appear without warning. The Eddystone had sailed within these parameters, yet nothing in the records indicates the crew anticipated the particular combination of hazards they ultimately faced. The confluence of environmental challenges, isolation, and imperfect charts illustrates the precariousness of seafaring at the edge of known maps. Stories persisted among northern communities of a lone ship seen through fog, a ghostly silhouette slipping silently past ice floes. While unverified, these tales reinforced the mystery, suggesting that even when physical evidence vanished, memory and legend preserved fragments of the voyage. The line between the Eddystone as a tangible vessel and as a spectral presence blurred in retellings, deepening the enigma. Decades later, explorers and historians revisited the logs, letters, and coastal accounts, attempting to reconstruct the ship's path. Each detail provided small insights into the Eddystone's journey, but failed to produce definitive answers. Ice charts, drift calculations, and anecdotal testimony combined into a mosaic that suggested peril and disappearance, but never certainty. The story remained open-ended, a puzzle resisting full resolution. The enduring fascination with the Eddystone reflects more than maritime tragedy. It embodies the uncertainty inherent in human attempts to conquer distant and dangerous landscapes. Adventure, commerce, and ambition collided with the unpredictable forces of nature, leaving only fragments of evidence for posterity. The ship's disappearance became a symbol of both courage and the limits of knowledge. The icy waters where the Eddystone was last seen remain largely uncharted in their subtle shifts, even centuries later. Currents move silently beneath the surface, and ice drifts with a will independent of human intention. The story of the ship endures in charts, logs, and whispered tales, reminding all who study it that the sea keeps its secrets jealously. On a mist-shrouded morning, when the horizon appears empty yet full of suggestion, the waters that once carried the Eddystone still seem to conceal her passage. The Fury and Hecla disaster, 1825. Ice fractured under a sudden swell, sending shards rattling against the hulls of HMS Fury and HMS Hecla as the ships crept into the unknown waters of Lancaster Sound. The sun glinted off the ridges, painting the sea in jagged reflections, while the horizon seemed both inviting and perilous. Every mile forward carried the explorers deeper into a world that measured their courage against invisible, relentless forces. The Arctic, vast and indifferent, had a way of reminding men that their control was an illusion. A hollow groan rose from the timbers as the Fury pitched against an unseen swell. The crew tightened their grips on railings, instinctively bracing against the constant motion. Instruments rattled, logs slid across tables, and the subtle sway became an almost hypnotic rhythm, masking the tension that gathered like storm clouds above the ice. Each sound carried a warning, a reminder that the sea could shift without notice and turn preparation into desperation. Tension crept along the deck, manifesting in stiff postures and narrowed eyes. Sailors whispered doubts about the safety of the routes charted months earlier, and officers debated whether ice that looked stable might conceal deep channels ready to swallow a vessel whole. Each decision had consequences, and hesitation could mean catastrophe. The Arctic's quiet, measured threat seeped into every conversation, every glance, and every movement. The Fury and Hecla were not the first ships to venture this far, but Lancaster Sound had yet to reveal all its secrets. The previous decade's explorers had reported shifting ice, hidden shoals, and currents that could mislead even the most experienced navigators. Knowledge accumulated in logs offered some guidance, yet the ice demanded continual vigilance. What seemed safe in one season could become treacherous the next, and the men understood that history was no shield against the Arctic's whims. A haze clung to the horizon, foreshadowing the approach of another storm. Clouds gathered in layered sheets, and the wind shifted with deceptive softness before gathering strength. Officers scanned the skies, noting subtle changes, while sailors adjusted sails and rigging in anticipation. Every moment carried the quiet insistence that the Arctic was an adversary both patient and unpredictable. The landscape around the ships remained an unbroken tableau of ice and water, punctuated only by the occasional floating berg. The sea itself seemed alive, as if watching the passage of these intruders. Crews measured distances, recorded observations, and noted features that might guide them or warn them, but the environment refused to yield certainty. The Arctic was a puzzle whose pieces were constantly shifting. Charts and compasses were scrutinized with painstaking care, though their reliability could not be assumed. Magnetic anomalies distorted readings, and drift ice obscured visual markers. Navigators relied on both instruments and intuition, aware that miscalculation might trap a ship or strand a sledging party. The subtle interplay of wind, current, and ice required constant attention, a mental burden as heavy as the physical demands of life aboard. Crew members felt the psychological strain in small ways. Silence grew long between commands, and laughter became infrequent. Every crack of ice or unexpected swell triggered a brief moment of alarm. Discipline and hierarchy guided action, but beneath formal orders, fear and uncertainty threaded through the deck. Men learned that trust had to be reinforced constantly, and even the most confident officers measured each instruction against a backdrop of doubt. Local Inuit knowledge, though limited in this remote stretch of Arctic waters, influenced some decisions about routes and timing. Sailors noted techniques for reading ice patterns, recognizing pressure ridges, and anticipating sudden shifts. Yet no guidance could entirely mitigate the omnipresent risk, and each decision balanced experience against unpredictability. Respect for the Arctic became as essential as maps and instruments. Sudden movements in the ice tested both vessels. Shifting flows created temporary channels and blocked others, forcing immediate adjustments. Crews worked in tense synchrony, responding to movements that threatened to crush hulls or separate ships. Even a single misstep could mean disaster, and each maneuver underscored the fragile advantage that skill offered against nature's might. Snow began to fall lightly, then more heavily, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly outlines. Visibility decreased rapidly, and what had appeared as navigable passages turned into potential traps. Officers relied on repeated observations and triangulation, yet every calculation seemed vulnerable to the next gust of wind or shift of ice. The Arctic permitted no certainty, only cautious approximation. Reflections on earlier choices lingered among the officers. Decisions made weeks before, routes selected, supplies allocated, sails reinforced, took on new significance as the environment asserted itself. Past judgments felt both necessary and insufficient, a reminder that foresight could mitigate risk but never eliminate it. Each reflection carried the weight of potential consequence, magnifying tension across the crew. Interactions on deck revealed subtle shifts in morale. Officers debated priorities, sailors executed tasks with wary precision, and all movements were shadowed by a sense of watching danger. Communication became a tool for survival, with clarity and timing often more vital than volume or insistence. Even minor lapses could provoke errors with dire outcomes. The Arctic weather shifted again, the wind picking up and temperatures dropping. Ice pressed against the hulls with increasing intensity, cracking and grinding as if testing the ship's endurance. Crews doubled their efforts to secure lines and reinforce structures. Each task carried urgency, and exhaustion weighed heavily against skill and experience. The environment was uncompromising, indifferent to human endeavour. Movement across the ice and through narrow channels became increasingly treacherous. The Fury and Hecla advanced cautiously, testing the thickness of flows, monitoring the crests of ridges, and tracking the subtle currents beneath. Every advance required careful assessment, a combination of knowledge and instinct, as one miscalculation might strand a vessel or lead to destruction. Even as the expedition pressed onward, mysteries persisted. Ice ridges appeared in impossible formations, drift patterns contradicted predictions, and occasional sounds, distant groans or sudden snaps, hinted at hidden hazards. Each anomaly added layers of uncertainty, reinforcing the sense that the Arctic held truths beyond immediate comprehension. The final hours of the disaster approached with quiet inevitability. Shifting ice trapped the Fury against immovable pressure ridges, while Hecla strained to respond, its movements constrained by the unforgiving environment. Men laboured against time, fatigue, and the encroaching cold, aware that survival depended on endurance and precise action. Every sound and movement amplified the tension. As ships creaked and groaned, the Arctic's power became undeniable. The Fury and Hecla, once proud instruments of exploration, were reduced to vessels at the mercy of forces far greater than human skill or ambition. Crews clung to routines and orders, but the outcome was shaped by ice, wind, and chance rather than choice. The loss of the Fury and the peril faced by the Hecla left a mark on Arctic history, a cautionary tale of ambition, miscalculation, and the relentless dominion of nature. Logs recovered later chronicled not just coordinates and observations, but the subtle, haunting details of an environment that rewarded respect and punished error without mercy. Even decades later, historians and explorers studying Lancaster Sound noted the lingering uncertainty surrounding the disaster. Patterns of ice and wind, the limits of contemporary navigation, and the unpredictable interactions of human and environment left questions unresolved. The Fury and Hecla disaster endured as a testament to the Arctic's enduring mystery. Beneath the frozen expanse, the Arctic seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether any who ventured into its dominion could ever claim understanding. The Vega Expedition's Ice Trap, 1878. A brittle morning sun reflected off endless white plains, turning the Arctic ice into a dazzling expanse that concealed danger beneath its glittering surface. The Vega, commanded by the Swedish explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld, moved cautiously through the partially frozen waters of the Caraci. The ship's hull creaked under intermittent pressure as ice floes shifted and collided, foreshadowing the trials that lay ahead. Every glance toward the horizon carried uncertainty, for the ice could shift without warning, imprisoning the vessel as it had ensnared explorers before. Crew members moved methodically on deck, adjusting lines and observing the surrounding ice with trained vigilance. Their experience had taught them that the Arctic demanded constant attention. A single misstep or misjudgment could lead to disaster. Even small fissures in the ice drew scrutiny, for they might widen and trap the Vega between immovable barriers. The atmosphere carried tension not merely of physical risk, but of the psychological weight of confinement, the feeling that the ice itself was an omnipresent observer. The expedition's significance was clear even in its earliest days. Nordenskjöld sought to chart the Northeast Passage, a feat that had eluded navigators for centuries, promising both scientific insight and national prestige. Maps of the region were sparse, composed largely from anecdotal sightings and rough sketches. The crew understood that every observation of ice thickness, currents, or coastline could become critical knowledge, yet the environment refused to be fully catalogued, revealing only fragments of the truth. Sudden movement of a large ice floe brought the ship to an abrupt halt, sending shivers through the hull and jolting men from their routines. Sharp cracks echoed across the surrounding sea, a reminder that the Arctic was capable of immediate and unpredictable change. Sledges and instruments had to be secured swiftly, and each crew member understood that survival depended on both speed and precision. The frozen sea, beautiful and indifferent, offered no mercy for hesitation. Within the Vega, crews exchanged tense glances, silent acknowledgement of the risks that lay ahead. Supplies were rationed carefully, and every step on the icy decks was calculated. Men moved in patterns that balanced efficiency with safety, yet the environment allowed no guarantees. The sense of isolation intensified as the ship became increasingly constrained by encroaching ice, and the knowledge that retreat could be impossible weighed on every mind. Scientific observations continued despite the looming peril. Thermometers recorded shifting temperatures, compasses noted subtle magnetic variations, and barometers tracked changing atmospheric pressure. These records were essential for understanding the Arctic, yet they also underscored human vulnerability. Each measurement hinted at forces larger than the crew's control, forces that could determine success or failure without warning. Unexpected ice formations created constant navigational puzzles. Pressure ridges rose like frozen waves, while thin sheets of ice revealed hidden water channels only after near catastrophic encounters. Nordenskjöld and his officers relied on both experience and intuition, triangulating positions with charts while observing the ever-shifting ice. Each correction was a gamble, and each misjudgment a step closer to entrapment. Mechanical challenges compounded the tension. Sails and rigging strained under gusting wind, and the ship's wooden hull endured repeated impacts against the ice. Repairs had to be conducted in freezing temperatures, sometimes under driving snow, with men battling frostbite and exhaustion. Every minor success in maintenance carried the unspoken knowledge that failure could leave the expedition immobilized, a floating trap in a landscape without escape. Days bled into nights, marked by the slow, relentless advance of ice and the constant pressure of cold. Even brief respites offered little relief, as the monotony of white, punctuated only by distant ice formations or moving wildlife, imposed a psychological burden. The crew's endurance was tested not only by exposure, but by the awareness that their surroundings were both alive with movement and entirely unyielding. Small, ominous signs hinted at the scale of the challenge. Ice pressure left deep grooves along the ship's hull, and small flows that seemed harmless at a distance threatened to wedge the vessel in place. Each observation required reassessment of strategies and routes. keeping the men in a state of heightened alertness. The Arctic presented its dangers incrementally, never all at once, ensuring that complacency was impossible. Interactions among officers and crew grew increasingly critical. Every decision, from rations to navigation, demanded consensus and careful calculation. Disagreement could slow action or create confusion, yet silence sometimes carried equal danger. Trust was both a shield and a liability. Human coordination was the only safeguard against environmental cruelty, yet even the most disciplined crew could be undone by the relentless ice. Geographic anomalies heightened the sense of unpredictability. Unmapped islands appeared briefly above the horizon, only to vanish in shifting fog or snow. The Vega's charts were updated meticulously, yet each new edition revealed further uncertainties, suggesting that the Arctic's true nature remained elusive. The environment demanded respect and humility, and the crew's growing realization of this fact coloured every movement and observation. Storms added immediate peril, turning familiar ice into a treacherous landscape. Visibility dropped to near zero as snow swept across the decks, and the ship was forced to drift within narrow channels. Sound carried strangely, amplifying the creak of wood and ice in ways that unnerved even the most experienced sailors. In these moments, every man recognized the Arctic's absolute authority over life and survival. Strategic decisions became matters of survival. Choosing whether to press forward or wait for safer conditions was fraught with consequences, each choice informed by observation, experience, and the risk of delay. The Vega could not simply turn away from danger. The ice dictated timing, routes, and progress, leaving human agency constrained to the narrow margins permitted by the environment. Fatigue and morale shaped daily life aboard the Vega. Prolonged exposure to cold, constant vigilance, and physical exertion eroded energy and patience. The crew's resilience was remarkable, yet psychological strain mirrored the tangible threats around them. The Arctic punished both inaction and haste, and maintaining equilibrium between courage and caution became an unending test. Foreshadowing of the expedition's ice trap grew as channels narrowed and ridges pressed in on all sides. The vessel's movements became increasingly restricted, the ice flowing around it in a manner that suggested inevitability. Even skilled navigation could not anticipate the full pattern of the flows, and the sense of being enclosed, held by an unseen force, became impossible to ignore. Consequences of prior choices emerged subtly but persistently. Decisions about provisioning, anchoring, and sledging created ripple effects across the expedition. What once seemed minor, a delay in route scouting, a misjudged ice drift, could now threaten immobilization. The Arctic enforced its rules patiently, ensuring that past actions determined present vulnerability. As the Vega finally settled into the grip of the ice, the crew's focus shifted entirely to endurance and observation. Supplies were monitored meticulously, scientific measurements continued, and minor repairs consumed hours of effort. The vessel had become both a laboratory and a prison, its crew observers of a world that refused to yield fully to human understanding. Each day was a negotiation with the ice, each night a vigil against the unknown. Subtle changes in the ice revealed the Arctic's continued dominance. Shifts of pressure ridges suggested movement beyond visible horizons, and even stationary flows carried hidden currents. The Vega was trapped not by a single event but by cumulative forces, a gradual immobilization that highlighted the environment's patient cruelty. Human ingenuity could delay fate but not eliminate it. The final weeks underscored the tension between knowledge and helplessness. Charts, observations, and meticulous records documented an Arctic world that had entrapped the expedition, yet offered insights into its patterns. The crew's survival relied on adaptation, discipline, and respect, and each action was measured against the realization that the ice could shift with devastating unpredictability. The Vega's frozen stillness in the Arctic expanse left an enduring image of both triumph and vulnerability, a demonstration that even well-prepared expeditions could become prisoners of nature. Every observation, every charted detail, and every daily decision reinforced the understanding that the environment's mysteries were vast and only partially revealed. The expedition captured both human endeavour and the Arctic's indifferent majesty. Beyond the limits of charts and instruments, the ice continued to move, patient and unyielding, as if guarding secrets that no observer could ever fully uncover. The Russian Caraci Convoy, 1916. Grey fog clung to the frozen horizon while the convoy's steel hulls glimmered faintly against sheets of shifting ice. The Caraci, notorious for its unforgiving winter grip, stretched endlessly in every direction, a frozen labyrinth of pressure ridges and hidden channels. In the summer of 1916, amidst the turmoil of World War I, the Russian Navy dispatched a convoy to supply distant outposts and maintain maritime connections across this desolate Arctic expanse. The task was simple in theory, but complex in execution, for the ice held dominion over all who dared navigate its deceptive surfaces. Ships nudged cautiously forward, their progress slowed by ridges that seemed to rise from nowhere. Crew members worked with deliberate precision, adjusting sails, rigging and engines as if the smallest miscalculation might bring disaster. Each vessel carried not just supplies and munitions, but the weight of a nation's strategic hopes, reliant upon human skill to outmaneuver the relentless hand of winter. The Arctic had always been a silent adversary, yet in the context of wartime urgency its threats were amplified. Lookouts strained against the cold, scanning the haze for signs of open water or looming danger. The horizon offered little guidance, obscured by the shimmering illusion of mirages that could deceive even the most experienced eyes. Icebergs appeared and disappeared with the shifting light, their enormity and unpredictability leaving no margin for error. Every glance through the telescope was a gamble, every observation a measure of survival. Commanders weighed each mile, aware that the Arctic could sever the convoy before any enemy action did. Decisions were made under constant tension, balancing speed against safety. Routes were chosen not merely for efficiency, but for the potential to avoid natural traps, while maintaining cohesion among the scattered vessels. The Caraci had a reputation for claiming ships that ignored its subtle warnings, and none aboard were willing to underestimate its power. The whistle of wind through rigging and the distant groan of ice set a rhythm both hypnotic and ominous. Nights were punctuated by the crack of shifting floes and the subtle tremor beneath hulls that warned of pressure ridges closing in. Sleep was fitful, taken in shifts while officers maintained vigilant watches, fully conscious that any lapse could become irreversible. Even routine maintenance carried the undercurrent of tension, for equipment failure in this environment could prove fatal. A sudden crack echoed from the starboard bow, raising instant alarm among the crew. Orders were shouted, sledges of tools moved into position, and every eye turned to measure the evolving threat. The ice was capricious, shifting under hidden currents, and each fracture signaled danger that could not be fully predicted. Anxiety spread in measured waves, reminding men that their environment held dominion over human planning. Earlier choices en route now demanded vigilance as trapped ice threatened movement. Some vessels in the convoy found themselves hemmed in by sudden closures, forced to pivot and retrace steps along treacherous channels. Coordination became a delicate dance, balancing the pressure of time with the stubborn realities of geography. Communications were rudimentary, reliant on signal flags and lanterns, each transfer of instruction carrying the possibility of misinterpretation in the swirling Arctic haze. Twilight descended, transforming familiar flows into shadowed labyrinths. Shapes of pressure ridges and ice hummocks merged into one indistinct mass, and the line between safe passage and deadly trap blurred. Navigation depended on memory, keen observation, and instinct honed through months of experience, yet even these could be insufficient against the Arctic's mercurial temperament. Every moment became an exercise in anticipation, every decision a wager against forces beyond comprehension. Exhaustion pressed heavily as men realized that skill alone might not ensure survival. Laboring through frigid nights and sunless mornings, they measured distance in inches, watched for shifting ice, and monitored the strain on hulls and engines. The cold seeped into bones and minds alike, dampening judgment and amplifying fear. Yet the convoy pressed on, guided by duty and the faint hope that their meticulous planning could outlast the Arctic's arbitrary cruelty. Beneath the frozen surface, the sea held dangers unseen, ready to punish a single misstep. Weak ice over submerged ridges could swallow small boats, while concealed channels threatened larger hulls. The water beneath the ice was a hidden predator, and every echo of cracking ice reminded sailors that the Arctic was as lethal below as it appeared above. Vigilance was not a choice. It was a necessity dictated by a realm indifferent to human ambition. Even the distant mountains seemed dwarfed by the expanses of unbroken ice. Their permanence was a visual anchor, a reminder of scale and isolation, yet they offered no guidance for traversing the immediate treacherous waters. Crews consulted charts obsessively, attempting to reconcile historical knowledge with real-time observation, aware that even minor errors could lead to catastrophe. The Arctic rewarded attention and punished oversight with equal impartiality. The creak of timbers under pressure echoed across the convoy, mingling with the rhythmic slap of icy water against hulls. Sound became a vital tool, revealing movements of ice or potential collisions long before they were visible. Men learned to read subtle shifts in auditory signals, correlating groans and snaps with likely ice behavior, interpreting every vibration as a potential premonition of disaster. A sudden gust pushed the lead ship sideways, forcing rapid adjustments from the helmsman. The convoy's formation wavered, and the cohesion necessary for mutual protection was strained. Each vessel maneuvered independently yet in coordination, balancing the need to avoid ice with the imperative to maintain group integrity. The tension in the air was palpable, each correction a silent testament to human perseverance against an environment that demanded both respect and constant action. Officers exchanged terse instructions, their voices nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Decision-making was precise, almost surgical, as the men of the convoy adapted to circumstances that evolved by the minute. Hierarchies were both reinforced and challenged by the immediacy of the Arctic threat, and leadership demanded clarity, courage, and the acceptance that nature might nullify even the best-laid plans. Even as the convoy moved forward, the ice whispered of obstacles yet unseen. Shadows and reflections betrayed hidden ridges, subtle changes in snow texture marked weak ice, and crevasses lurked beneath deceptively flat surfaces. Observation became both science and instinct, a blend of careful measurement and learned intuition that could tip the balance between survival and disaster. Thin sheets of ice concealed channels and pressure ridges that could trap ships in moments. One misjudged turn, one misread current, and a vessel could be immobilized for days or damaged irreparably. Crew members monitored hull integrity constantly, noting every creak and flex, knowing that structural compromise in these conditions could be fatal and uncorrectable until rescue, if it came at all. The Caraci had claimed vessels before, and the convoy moved with the awareness of its own fragility. History loomed in the background, a silent admonition that Arctic expeditions were rarely mere exercises in navigation. Losses were permanent, and survival often hinged upon a combination of preparation, luck, and the ability to read a world that deliberately obscured its hazards. Stretching beyond sight, the ice field seemed endless, a frozen wilderness indifferent to human plans. Each day passed with minor victories and constant vigilance, yet no certainty was achieved. The convoy pressed onward not toward conquest but toward endurance, navigating a terrain where the line between progress and peril was defined by shifting ice, changing weather, and the inexorable logic of nature. Ships creaked and groaned as night fell, lanterns flickering in the fog and snow, casting long shadows on uneven ice. Sleep was stolen in brief intervals, watches rotated with military precision, and the Arctic continued its silent surveillance. Every step forward was an act of calculation, every mile a testament to the fragile grip of human endeavour against an environment both beautiful and lethal. Amidst the cold and uncertainty, the convoy's existence became a delicate balance of observation, reaction, and survival. Ice moved in patterns imperceptible to all but the most experienced, currents shifted beneath deceptive surfaces, and the horizon offered promises that could not be trusted. The Arctic was a constant, impartial arbiter of fortune, and every member of the convoy was compelled to measure itself against it. The Russian Caraci convoy of 1916 traversed a frozen expanse where each decision carried weight and consequence beyond calculation, and the ice itself seemed to guard secrets that would never fully be revealed. The Andrée balloon expedition, 1897. The Arctic sky stretched endlessly, a pale dome that blurred the line between horizon and heavens. The hydrogen balloon of the Andrée expedition hung beneath its fragile envelope, swaying as the wind tugged at its ropes. The explorers, Salomon August Andrée, Niels Strindberg and Knut Frankel, felt the oppressive weight of isolation settle around them, the vastness of the Arctic indifferent to human ambition. Patches of canvas had been reinforced, cords retied, Yet even these precautions offered little comfort. Navigation instruments were small and cumbersome, their readings subject to the mercy of winds that moved faster than the eye could track. Every adjustment of the rudder lines carried with it the fragile hope of maintaining course over uncharted and unforgiving terrain. Movement within the basket was cautious, each explorer performing tasks with precision. Andrée manipulated the ropes with steady hands, Strindberg recorded observations of drifting ice patterns, and Frankel adjusted the release valves for altitude control. Their coordination was a fragile choreography, dependent on trust, concentration, and the knowledge that missteps could cost them the Arctic itself. Ice floes jostled like puzzle pieces under the pressure of unseen currents, revealing cracks that stretched for miles. Scientific recording became both ritual and obsession. Thermometers tracked the drop in temperature with each passing hour, while barometers fluctuated in ways that hinted at unseen weather fronts. The expedition's meticulous notes captured every anomaly, the subtle tilt of icebergs, the distribution of pressure ridges, the odd glint of refrozen water. Each entry was a tether to logic amid the chaos of drifting sky and shifting ice. A sudden change in the wind brought tension to a peak. The balloon tilted violently, ropes straining against the basket. For a moment, the Arctic seemed to assert itself as an unseen predator, reminding the men that their journey existed at the mercy of invisible forces. Control was an illusion, and every decision now carried a heightened risk. The psychological strain manifested subtly. Conversation grew sparse, each word weighed for necessity. The isolation imposed by altitude and horizon created a pressure cooker of anticipation and caution. Yet each man pressed on, their focus anchored in duty and preparation. Glances downward revealed an ever-changing puzzle. Flows that seemed passable gave way to open water, revealing the Arctic's capacity to deceive. Reflections and shadows tricked both perception and instruments, creating phantom ridges and false leads. The explorers documented these illusions with care, knowing that future attempts at polar navigation would rely on accurate records, even if their own journey teetered on misinterpretation. The environment was a teacher whose lessons were both subtle and unforgiving. As days stretched onward, fatigue began to seep into every action. Hands grew numb from handling lines, eyes blurred with constant scrutiny, and the cold gnawed at both morale and muscle. The balloon's motion offered no respite. Every drift over ice demanded continued vigilance. Supplies were finite, rations carefully measured, yet the mental strain weighed heavier than any hunger. The crew's endurance was tested on levels that charts and notes could scarcely capture, as isolation amplified both physical and psychological vulnerabilities. Unexpected cloud formations added layers of complexity. Thick, low-lying fog obscured sightlines, while high-altitude cirrus hinted at approaching storms. Each correction of the balloon's path was a calculated gamble, balancing the risk of immediate hazards with the uncertain promise of safer skies. The Arctic revealed itself not as static, but as an active, calculating presence, capable of both concealment and revelation. Attempts to gauge position relied on a delicate interplay of observation and instrumentation. Sextants were deployed to measure angles to the sun, barometers tracked pressure changes, and compasses provided orientation, even as magnetic anomalies whispered doubt. Despite these tools, the balloon drifted unpredictably, the men at the mercy of currents that refused categorization. The strain of prolonged exposure became palpable in gestures and routines. Movements slowed, eyes squinted against glare, and minor disputes over course adjustments hinted at underlying tensions. Cooperation was paramount, yet the Arctic's vastness imposed a relentless pressure that tested patience, skill, and leadership simultaneously. Every decision became an exercise in risk management, balancing ambition against survival with nothing more tangible than sky, ice, and wind. Evidence of prior Arctic journeys occasionally punctuated the drifting emptiness. Small relics of earlier expeditions, weather-beaten and frozen, suggested human presence yet provided no guidance. The balloon passed over these fragments like a ghost, offering both hope and the reminder that the Arctic tolerated neither complacency nor overconfidence. Each sighting reinforced the reality that discovery and danger were inseparable companions on the northern frontier. As weeks advanced, the Arctic's silence became oppressive. The crew's awareness sharpened in response, yet the sensory distortions heightened unease. Each creak of canvas or rush of wind carried amplified significance, emphasizing the tenuous line between controlled flight and the potential for disaster. Observation became a survival mechanism as much as a scientific exercise. Occasional glimpses of land, distant and indistinct, offered fleeting exhilaration. Mountains rose like phantom shapes beyond the horizon, only to vanish in drifting snow or low-lying clouds. Yet even with these efforts, the landscape remained ambiguous, a liminal space where hope and illusion intertwined. The explorers navigated not only geography but the fragile boundary between perception and reality. Subtle environmental cues guided decisions more than any map. Ice coloration, wind shifts, and the pattern of drifting snowflakes suggested currents invisible to instruments. The crew's attention to these details underscored the Arctic's dominance over human plans. Moments of minor success punctuated the ongoing tension. Temporary stabilization of altitude, identification of navigable channels, and the occasional break in cloud cover offered reprieve and evidence of skill. The Arctic demanded humility, reinforcing the understanding that even controlled progress was fleeting and contingent on circumstances beyond human mastery. As supplies dwindled and the balloon drifted further from known land, the expedition confronted an undeniable truth. The Arctic could not be tamed. Even with careful observation, instrument readings, and sustained vigilance, the environment remained an arbiter of destiny. Each choice carried consequences magnified by the isolation and uncertainty of the northern sky, a reminder that courage alone could not guarantee survival. The final days were marked by a quiet, relentless tension. The balloon's slow drift carried the men over unbroken ice and frozen channels, far beyond verification by human standards. Every decision, adjusting ballast, noting wind direction, rationing provisions, held amplified weight. Their meticulously recorded observations persisted as a testament to effort, yet the Arctic maintained its inscrutability. The Andrée expedition's trajectory ultimately blurred the line between exploration and disappearance. Journal entries, scientific records, and observational notes preserved knowledge, yet the fate of the explorers remained enshrouded in mystery. The balloon traversed a realm where human control was subordinate to environmental forces, and every measure of achievement coexisted with the awareness of vulnerability. The sky held them, drifting towards an unknown horizon where ice, wind, and silence would continue to watch without answer. The Soviet Severnaya Zemlya expedition, 1937. Auroras stretched across the northern sky like restless phantoms, their shimmering colours reflected in the broken ice of the Caraci. The Soviet Severnaya Zemlya expedition moved cautiously across frozen channels, aware that each step brought them deeper into uncharted territory. The archipelago, newly charted and scarcely visited, seemed to pulse with the weight of untold secrets as the expedition pushed northward from the icebound port of Arkhangelsk. Every decision demanded vigilance, for in this expanse mistakes could become permanent. Heavy sledges groaned under the weight of provisions as men struggled over pressure ridges and ridged floes. The hauling was relentless, each sledging day stretching longer as thin ice threatened to give way beneath them. Equipment cracked in the cold, and even seasoned engineers marvelled at the harshness of the environment. Supplies were meticulously rationed, yet the very act of movement consumed reserves faster than anticipated, forcing the expedition to weigh survival against ambition with every measured mile. Barometric readings fell sharply, signalling storms that could arrive without warning. Instruments were checked repeatedly, yet charts and calculations offered only partial reassurance against the Arctic's whims. Wind patterns shifted unpredictably, drawing fog across observation points and erasing familiar markers. The team adapted constantly, learning to read subtle cues in the ice and sky that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. A thin layer of fog drifted in from the northeast, concealing distant promontories and revealing only their shadows as shapes against whiteness. Visibility was reduced to a few meters, and navigation became a matter of cautious estimation. Sound carried strangely across the frozen channels, masking hidden cracks or sudden breaks in the ice. The men advanced slowly, eyes trained on the surface beneath their boots, hearts aware that one misstep could undo weeks of careful planning. The team moved with precision, yet every glance betrayed the growing anxiety of isolation. Crew members measured each other's responses as carefully as they measured the terrain, knowing that endurance was fragile and morale could falter under endless cold. Encounters with sudden storms tested cohesion, and minor disagreements risked cascading into operational hazards. In this environment, survival was as much psychological as it was physical. The ground beneath the sleds cracked and shifted, revealing seams and fissures unmarked on any map. Explorers documented these anomalies carefully, understanding that new knowledge of the terrain might save future expeditions. Each break in the ice seemed to whisper of hidden forces, ancient pressures beneath the frozen surface that no human calculations could fully anticipate. Even when progress resumed, the crew remained alert, wary that every ridge and channel might conceal new threats. By the second month, routine had been replaced with ceaseless vigilance. Schedules of observation, measurement, and movement were dictated entirely by environmental conditions. Temperatures fluctuated without warning, creating layers of brittle ice over soft patches that threatened sledges and men alike. Hours stretched, with nothing to punctuate the monotony except the occasional crack of ice and the eerie stillness that descended between storms. Scattered remnants of earlier Arctic surveys hinted at paths once attempted and abandoned, suggesting that other expeditions had faced the same unyielding challenges. Discarded markers, frozen supplies, and fragments of previous maps reminded the crew that Severnaya Zemlya was no stranger to human ambition, yet it yielded its secrets grudgingly and often at great cost. These traces provided guidance, but also a stark reminder of the thin line between discovery and catastrophe. The wind carried a sharp tang of frozen water, cutting through layers of cloth and determination alike. Sensory vigilance became as critical as technical expertise, with men attuned to subtle changes in temperature, texture of the ice, and distant sounds that might indicate shifting flows. Even minor misjudgments could trigger cascading dangers, leaving no room for error in an environment designed to challenge all assumptions. Survey instruments recorded each anomaly with careful precision, yet the Arctic offered contradictions at every turn. Magnetic readings fluctuated, pressure ridges shifted overnight, and channels that appeared solid one day might fracture the next. Maps were created and redrawn, but uncertainty persisted, for Severnaya Zemlya resisted any attempt at complete comprehension. Each discovery, no matter how painstaking, was a reminder of the limits of human perception in a land dominated by ice and storm. Unexpected weather compounded the strain on supplies and schedules. Snow drifts buried markers and sledging paths, while sudden thaws left patches of treacherous slush amid solid ice. Every deviation from the plan risked exposing men to frostbite, fatigue, and the unknown. The expedition advanced with caution, each measured decision carrying weight not only for immediate survival, but for the preservation of knowledge that might guide future explorers. Small landmarks appeared, yet their constancy was only an illusion. Channels widened or narrowed, and cliffs seemed to vanish behind drifting mists. The crew learned to accept that certainty was fleeting, and that documentation was both a necessity and a gamble against the Arctic's impermanence. Each observation was recorded with meticulous care, preserving evidence of existence even as the terrain seemed determined to erase it. Valuable insights into the Arctic's geography emerged despite the hardships of the expedition. Glaciers, ice caps, and hidden channels were charted, while wildlife tracks offered hints of survival strategies under extreme conditions. Scientific findings, though significant, were secondary to the overarching lesson. Severnaya Zemlya was a realm where human ambition collided constantly with environmental supremacy. As the expedition reached the outer islands of the archipelago, ice conditions grew increasingly unpredictable. Even familiar landmarks became unreliable, with shifting flows isolating crews from supply points and communication lines. Every step was weighed against unknown forces beneath the surface, reinforcing the notion that Arctic mastery was a fleeting illusion, dependent entirely on vigilance, adaptability, and respect for the landscape. No single observation could capture the entirety of Severnaya Zemlya. Each measurement, chart, and recorded anomaly was part of a larger mosaic of uncertainty, a testament to the expedition's perseverance amid conditions that refused to yield complete understanding. Knowledge gained was significant yet partial, leaving as many questions unanswered as it illuminated. The Arctic night approached without warning, swallowing the horizon and cloaking the islands in shadow. Ice groaned under pressure, and distant storms heralded unknown dangers. The Soviet Severnaya Zemlya expedition had endured the relentless cold and unpredictable terrain, leaving behind a trail of meticulous records and observations. Yet the archipelago continued to conceal secrets beyond reach, waiting for the next explorers to confront its hidden truths. Past the mapped ridges and icy channels, Severnaya Zemlya whispered mysteries beyond the reach of any logbook. The ghost ship, Baychimo, 1931. A pall of grey mist hung over the frozen straits, swallowing the horizon and isolating the Baychimo in a world of ice. The ship, once a sturdy cargo vessel of the Hudson Bay Company, now drifted abandoned, her timbers creaking under the pressure of shifting floes. For the men who first spotted her, the sight was both extraordinary and disquieting, a familiar shape rendered alien by solitude and frost, motionless yet seemingly aware of its frozen surroundings. From the ridge above, hunters squinted at the dark shape among the ice, uncertain whether the eye deceived them or if the vessel truly floated. Whispers passed along the group. Had it been left to the elements, or did some force guide its eerie journey across the Arctic waters? Each movement of the ice carried her closer or further from their vantage point, as if the ship obeyed a rhythm unknown to human observers. Ice shifted beneath the hull, creaking and groaning as if the Baychimo itself breathed. The surrounding pack groaned in response, a chorus of frozen pressure that echoed across the barren expanse. Waves of cold water lapped weakly against the bow, leaving frosted traces that glimmered in brief shafts of sunlight. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence, a reminder of the vessel's fragile endurance amid a harsh and indifferent environment. Built in 1914, the Baychimo had served the Hudson Bay Company faithfully, before becoming an Arctic wanderer after her abandonment in 1931. Laden with furs and supplies, she had been trapped in the ice, her crew forced to evacuate under extreme duress. Despite the efforts to secure her, the ship refused to succumb to the Arctic entirely. Subsequent sightings by trappers and explorers revealed a vessel neither sunken nor completely still, haunting the frozen passages like a relic suspended between life and decay. A hollow thump echoed across the ice, carried by the wind, announcing the ship's lonely presence before it came into view. Dogs barked nervously in the distance, responding to a sound too deliberate to belong entirely to natural forces. Even seasoned hunters paused, noting the rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the vessel itself, a warning or a call that went unanswered. Fog rolled across the frozen bay, obscuring the hull until only its shadow lingered, a dark memory in white. The effect was surreal. The ship appeared, vanished, and reappeared, her form shifting with the movement of mist and snow. Observers could not determine whether she was drifting freely or anchored by unseen ice, but the impression was of a spectral presence, stubbornly refusing to be charted or controlled. No one could say whether the ship had drifted in by chance, or if some unseen current guided her inexorably through the ice. Reports from different years described her position differently, creating a map of ambiguity that challenged navigators and intrigued adventurers. Each account added to the legend, yet none resolved the question of how a vessel, abandoned and stripped of crew, could persist so long in the frozen Arctic. Through countless winters and summers, the Baychimo reappeared like a ghost, never aging yet never moving beyond its Arctic prison. Trappers who attempted to board her found interiors coated in frost, provisions rotted or gone, and equipment half buried in ice. The ship's skeleton preserved the memory of human presence while insisting on its autonomy, a liminal space between human history and the relentless natural world. The vessel floated like a dark relic in a white ocean, a monument to human ambition caught in eternal exile. Even as sighting parties approached cautiously, they noted her decks slick with ice and her masts leaning yet intact. Each encounter reinforced the notion that the Baychimo had survived conditions that would destroy ordinary ships, yet she remained inaccessible and unknowable, a frozen enigma adrift. Any approach risked being trapped on shifting ice, yet curiosity drew men closer to the Baychimo's spectral silhouette. Sleighs and small boats attempted to navigate toward her, only to be forced back by sudden cracks and unsteady ice. The Arctic played no favourites. All who ventured near were reminded that survival depended on caution, and the ship seemed to thrive in the tension between proximity and retreat. Hunting crews reported finding footprints leading to the ship and then abruptly stopping, as though the men had vanished into thin air. Items left on deck were discovered months later in different positions, fueling speculation about what, if anything, maintained the vessel's eerie persistence. Each observation deepened the mystery, intertwining natural phenomena with the impression of a deliberate movement. Winter storms often concealed the Baychimo completely, leaving only an occasional mast or hull fragment visible above the snow. When the sun returned, explorers would glimpse her again, unchanged yet hauntingly present, as though time itself respected the vessel's suspension. Every sighting challenged the understanding of Arctic navigation and the limits of human intervention in an unforgiving environment. In the years following her abandonment, the ship became a legend among northern communities. Tales spoke of her drifting hundreds of miles from the last recorded position, appearing in bays and inlets thought inaccessible. The repetition of these appearances created a sense of inevitability, as if the Baychimo were a wandering sentinel of the Arctic, bound neither by maps nor human expectation. Even decades after 1931, accounts of the Baychimo persisted, her form glimpsed against icebergs, fog, and snowfields. Each report confirmed her enduring presence, a silent witness to the desolation and beauty of the frozen north. Historians and explorers puzzled over how a single vessel could evade the finality of decay and continue to haunt the Arctic, inspiring both awe and unease. The ship's drift, untraceable and inconsistent, became a riddle embedded in Arctic folklore and exploration logs alike. Maps could chart routes, but none could predict her next appearance. Her resilience contrasted sharply with the vulnerability of those who sought her, reminding all observers that the Baychimo existed according to rules unknown, moving through space and time as a solitary ghost. The Baychimo endured beyond reason, a vessel neither fully alive nor entirely surrendered to the Arctic, drifting eternally where no chart could capture her course.